I applied for a job at my husband's tech company. The HR director looked confused and said, "Ma'am, we need to disclose conflicts of interest." When I said my husband was Ryan Preston, the CEO, she went pale. "Mrs. Preston works here. She is our head of operations. She reports directly to Ryan." I smiled calmly and said, "I think we need to talk. My name is Naomi, and I am 33 years old. I am a licensed forensic accountant, but for the past 5 years, I have been a stay-at-home wife." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who underestimated your worth. Growing up in a quiet suburb, I always believed in the power of truth and numbers. That is why I became a forensic accountant. I specialized in tracking hidden assets and untangling financial messes. But 5 years ago, when my husband Ryan started his tech company, I made a choice that changed everything. I left my high-paying corporate job to be his silent partner. I managed our lives, balanced his early chaotic books, and kept our home running perfectly so he could focus on being the visionary leader. Now that OmniStream Tech is valued at hundreds of millions of dollars and just weeks away from an initial public offering, I decided it was time to reclaim my career. I wanted the internal audit director position. It was a role I was more than qualified for. Walking into the sleek Silicon Valley headquarters that morning felt strange. The lobby was all brushed steel and expensive minimalist furniture. Young employees rushed past with overpriced coffees. Ryan had always told me to stay home, claiming the modern corporate environment was too ruthless for my quiet nature. He constantly drilled into my head that I was better suited for baking and decorating our suburban house. But walking down those hallways, I knew the financial reports and the numbers better than anyone in that building. I approached the reception desk and asked to see Brenda, the human resources director. Brenda was a woman in her 50s with a polite professional demeanor. She invited me into her corner office, which overlooked the entire tech campus. I handed her my resume and told her I was applying for the open audit position. Initially, Brenda seemed incredibly impressed. Her eyes scanned my honors degrees and my extensive background at a top accounting firm. She kept nodding and offering compliments until her eyes landed on my personal information and marital status. That was when the temperature in the room dropped. Brenda's eyes widened. She looked at me, then at the paper, and then back at me with absolute panic. The hand holding my resume actually started to shake. She tried to keep her voice steady as she asked me to clarify my relationship with the Chief Executive Officer, Ryan Preston. I smiled gently, thinking she was just surprised by my humility. I told her Ryan and I had been married for 7 years, that I had supported him since the company was just an idea on paper, and that I was finally ready to officially join the team. Brenda swallowed hard. She leaned back in her ergonomic chair, as if trying to put as much physical distance between us as possible. She stuttered, saying there must be some sort of severe administrative mistake. She explained that the company already had a registered Mrs. Preston on the executive board. Vanessa Montgomery, the chief operating officer, had legally changed her name in the human resources system to Vanessa Preston 6 months ago, citing public relations strategies. Brenda added that Vanessa attended all crucial investor galas with Ryan as his legal wife. The press and the shareholders all knew them as the perfect tech power couple. Those words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The sterile hum of the air conditioning suddenly grew so loud, I could hear my own heartbeat slowing down. The man I had shared a bed with for 7 years was publicly parading another woman in the corporate world as his official wife. Not just a secret mistress, but his own chief operating officer. They were spinning a fake marriage narrative to sell an image of rock-solid stability to venture capitalists. And Ryan had successfully trapped me in our quiet suburban home, completely isolating me from his real life, while Vanessa stole my identity to climb to the top of the corporate ladder. I suddenly remembered the night before, when I excitedly told Ryan about applying for the job. He had smirked sarcastically and said I had lost my sharp edge after all these years just hanging around the kitchen. He insisted the modern workplace would eat me alive, and I would only embarrass myself. Now I understood the root cause of why he tried so hard to stop me. He was not protecting me from the harsh corporate world. He was protecting his deceptive stage play from the light of truth. By now, Brenda was in a full-blown panic. She frantically reached for her desk phone, probably to call security or call Ryan down to handle this. Her finger hovered over the dial pad, trembling. She asked if she should report this immediately to the CEO. She looked at me warily, as if I were a delusional stalker who had somehow forged identification documents. At that exact second, the forensic accountant in my brain switched to maximum capacity. I realized that throwing a fit, crying, or breaking things right now would destroy my entire advantage. If I showed any agitation, Ryan would easily flip the script. He was a narcissist and a master manipulator. He would tell the board and the press that I was a mentally unstable woman trying to smear the company just before the IPO. I could not act like a weak victim. I was someone who found the truth in numbers, and I never solved problems with tears. I solved them with undeniable receipts. I leaned over the glass desk and firmly pressed my finger down on the phone receiver, cutting off Brenda's dial tone completely. I looked straight into her eyes with an expression so cold and calm it made her hold her breath. I told her in a flat tone that calling him would not be necessary. I smiled and added that there was obviously a slight misunderstanding on my part regarding the executive structure. I slowly gathered my resume, cover letter, and certificates, tucking them neatly back into my leather bag. Brenda looked terrified by my unnatural composure. She timidly asked what I was planning to do, reminding me that Ryan was ruthless when it came to protecting the company image. I stood up straight and smoothed out my skirt. I thanked Brenda for her time and her unexpected honesty. I told her she had helped me understand a great deal and that I would handle this matter privately at home. Before walking out the door, I paused, looked back at her, and gently advised her to pretend this meeting never happened if she wanted to protect her own job when the storm hit. I walked out of that magnificent glass building with my head held high. I did not rush away. I did not get into my car to cry on the steering wheel. I sat in the driver's seat of my older sedan, staring coldly at Ryan's brand new luxury sports car, parked proudly in the reserved CEO spot. He thought he was so smart. He thought he could keep me in a neat little suburban box while he built a massive empire with a fake wife. But he forgot one devastating detail. He forgot I was the one who taught him how to hide financial gaps in the early days. He forgot I had the power to dissect and trace every single penny, no matter how well hidden. This war was not going to end in tears. It was just beginning, and I was about to execute a full audit to wipe out his entire life. I sat in the center of our massive, sterile kitchen waiting for the sound of his car. The dinner I had spent 2 hours preparing was sitting on the marble island, completely cold. I did not care. My eyes were fixed on the clock on the wall. At exactly 8 in the evening, the heavy front door opened and Ryan walked in. He smelled like expensive cologne and the arrogant confidence of a chief executive officer about to take his tech company public. He dropped his leather briefcase by the door, loosened his silk tie, and walked into the kitchen with a tired but highly self-satisfied smile. He walked toward me, planning to give me his usual meaningless greeting kiss on the forehead. I stepped back just enough to avoid him. I reached onto the counter, picked up the printed human resources file I had taken from the office that morning, and slid it across the smooth marble surface. The paper stopped right in front of him. It displayed a high-definition professional photo of Vanessa Montgomery wearing a designer blazer. Right below her smiling face was her official corporate title, Chief Operating Officer, and the name she was using legally within the company walls, Vanessa Preston. I stood there in complete silence. I was waiting for the panic to set in. I expected him to stutter or make up some clumsy excuse, or perhaps even beg for forgiveness, now that his massive lie was sitting right in front of him. But Ryan did not flinch. He did not turn pale. He looked down at the document, and then looked up at me, and actually let out a short, amused laugh. It was a cold, dry sound, completely devoid of any guilt. He calmly pulled out a bar stool and sat down across from me, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me, not like a husband caught in a massive betrayal, but like a disappointed parent, looking at a child who simply did not understand how the real world worked. He started his psychological manipulation immediately. His voice was steady and condescending as he told me I was blowing everything completely out of proportion. He said my bored housewife brain was inventing stupid conspiracy theories because I had nothing better to do all day. He explained with absolute sheer arrogance that what I was looking at was not an affair, but a highly calculated public relations strategy. He leaned forward and told me that Silicon Valley was not like the boring accounting firms I used to work for 5 years ago. Venture capitalists do not just buy shares in a software platform, they buy a compelling narrative, they buy an image of the founders, and the image they are desperate to throw millions of dollars at is a modern, stylish power couple who shares a futuristic vision. Ryan began pacing around the kitchen island, treating me like an audience in a boardroom pitch. He said I needed to understand the immense pressure of a man carrying an entire empire on his shoulders. He explained that having Vanessa by his side was strictly a business tool. She knew how to smile perfectly for the tech magazine covers. She knew how to hold a champagne flute at charity galas and throw around meaningless tech jargon to keep the wealthy investors entertained. He had the audacity to tell me that I should actually be grateful to Vanessa. He claimed she was doing all the exhausting superficial networking on my behalf so that I could comfortably enjoy my peaceful life at home. His narcissism was so deeply rooted that he genuinely believed stripping away my identity and replacing me with a corporate stand-in was a massive favor he was doing for me. He did not stop there. He launched into cruel insults aimed straight at my self-esteem. He smirked and told me to take a good look at myself in the mirror. He gestured at my simple, comfortable clothes and bluntly stated that a quiet woman who liked gardening and balancing household budgets could never stand next to him on the cover of Forbes magazine. He said Vanessa was young, ambitious, sharp, and technologically savvy, making her the perfect missing puzzle piece for this billion-dollar corporate stage play. The fact that she changed her name in the human resources system and played his wife at lavish dinners was just a practical business arrangement to build absolute investor confidence. He claimed he was doing all of this terrible deceit for the ultimate future of our family and the immense wealth we would possess after the initial public offering. I stood there like a statue listening to every single bold-faced lie pouring from the mouth of the man I had sacrificed my entire youth to support. He felt absolutely zero remorse. He viewed my silent sacrifices over the last 5 years as completely worthless. I was the one who managed every single penny when he started with nothing. I was the one who gave up a brilliant forensic accounting career, so he would never have to worry about a single thing when he came home. And now, right before the massive payout, he ruthlessly decided I was not glamorous enough to stand in the spotlight with him. When he saw that I remained silent and did not break down crying like he expected, his fake patience vanished. His demeanor shifted from condescending to outright aggressive. He slammed both of his hands on the marble island, leaning aggressively toward me. His eyes were dark and cold. He told me in a low, threatening tone that this initial public offering was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and he was not going to let anyone ruin it, especially not a jealous housewife. He explicitly forbade me from ever stepping foot near the company headquarters again. He ordered me to never contact anyone in his executive team. He pointed his finger directly at my face, emphasizing every single word. He declared that if I dared to make a scene about this, or if I leaked any negative information to the press or the board of directors, he would immediately freeze every single credit card and bank account in my possession. He ruthlessly reminded me that every single asset we had, from the massive house we were standing in to the car sitting in the driveway, was legally tied to his name or the corporate holding company. He threatened to kick me out onto the street with absolutely nothing and use his top-tier corporate lawyers to ensure I never saw a single dime in a divorce settlement. Ryan stood up straight, adjusted his expensive suit jacket, and gave me a fake reassuring pat on the shoulder that felt more like a warning strike. He advised me to be a good, obedient wife, stay home, go shopping, visit the spa, and quietly enjoy the luxurious life he was providing. He turned his back on me and walked up the grand staircase, leaving me completely alone in the cold kitchen. I watched him disappear into the shadows of the hallway. My fingernails were digging so deeply into my palms that they almost drew blood, but I absolutely refused to shed a single tear. Ryan thought that controlling the bank accounts and the property deeds meant he had backed me into a corner. He genuinely believed that a financial threat could force a licensed forensic accountant to get on her knees and submit. He had completely underestimated the woman standing in his kitchen. I slowly walked over to the trash can and dropped the printed profile of Vanessa inside. I did not need to scream or throw a tantrum. I did not need to beg a traitor for mercy. Tonight, as soon as he fell into a deep sleep, I was going to crack open his home office computer, and I was going to show him exactly how fast a real audit could tear down his imaginary empire. I was still standing in the cold kitchen staring at the empty hallway where Ryan had just disappeared. My mind was racing with financial formulas and audit strategies. I was calculating exactly how long it would take to dismantle his corporate shell games. But before I could even take a step toward his home office, the digital lock on the front door beeped loudly. Someone was punching in the master passcode. A second later, the heavy mahogany door swung open and my sister-in-law Audrey marched inside. She did not knock. She did not announce herself. She walked into my home with the supreme entitlement of someone who believed she owned everything she looked at. Audrey was Ryan's younger sister, and she had always treated me like an unpaid servant. She was wearing a perfectly tailored designer trench coat and holding a luxury handbag that cost more than my first car. Her high heels clicked aggressively against the hardwood floor, echoing through the silent house. She found me in the kitchen and immediately crossed her arms. Her face twisted into a nasty sneer. Ryan had clearly texted her about my little visit to the Human Resources Department because she looked absolutely furious. She did not even say hello. She walked right up to the marble island and demanded to know what on earth I was thinking going to the company headquarters. Her voice was shrill and dripping with absolute contempt. She called me a pathetic freeloader who was trying to sabotage her brother's lifelong dream just because I was bored and jealous. She said I had spent the last 5 years sitting around the house doing absolutely nothing, while Ryan built an empire from the ground up. She actually had the nerve to look me up and down and say I was completely useless to a man of his stature. I looked at her trying to process the sheer audacity of her words. This was the same Audrey who used to call me crying in the middle of the night 5 years ago when she overdrew her bank accounts. I was the one who fixed her credit score. I was the one who quietly paid her credit card bills so her parents would not find out. And now she was standing in my kitchen calling me a parasite. She leaned across the counter and told me I was completely delusional if I thought I belonged in the corporate world. She said the investors did not want to see a frumpy housewife hovering around the boardroom. They wanted a sharp, dynamic woman. They wanted Vanessa. Hearing her say Vanessa's name so casually made my blood run cold. I asked her very quietly how long she had known about the fake wife arrangement. Audrey let out a loud mocking laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. She threw her head back and looked at me as if I were the stupidest person on the planet. She proudly confessed that she had known from the very beginning. In fact, she bragged that the entire family knew. She told me that just last week my parents-in-law hosted a massive private dinner at the most exclusive restaurant in the city. They invited the lead venture capitalists who were funding the initial public offering, and sitting right there at the head of the table next to Ryan was Vanessa. My stomach completely dropped. The betrayal was not just Ryan, it was a massive orchestrated conspiracy involving the entire Preston family. Audrey smiled wickedly and described how my mother-in-law had actually held Vanessa's hand across the table and introduced her to the billionaire investors as her beautiful, brilliant daughter-in-law. She said my father-in-law had given a toast praising Ryan and Vanessa as the perfect modern power couple who were going to change the world. They all sat there drinking $1,000 champagne laughing, and securing their financial futures, while I was at home, carefully folding Ryan's laundry and balancing his personal checkbook. I asked her how they could possibly justify erasing me from the family after everything I had done for them. Audrey did not even blink. Her eyes were completely devoid of empathy. She bluntly told me that it was strictly business and that I needed to stop being so emotionally dramatic. She explained that the initial public offering was going to make their entire family insanely wealthy. Ryan had promised to buy their parents a new vacation estate, and he was going to give Audrey a massive trust fund. She explicitly stated that they were not going to let my fragile feelings stand in the way of millions of dollars. In their greedy eyes, I was just collateral damage. I was a stepping stone they had used to cross the river, and now they were eagerly kicking me away. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger at my chest and told me to accept my reality. She ordered me to stay quietly in the house and wait for the divorce papers after the company went public. She promised that if I stayed silent and cooperative, Ryan might give me a generous alimony check so I could buy a nice little apartment somewhere far away from them. But if I tried to blow the whistle, she swore the entire family would publicly destroy my reputation. They would testify that I was mentally unstable and abusive. Audrey stood there waiting for me to break down. She wanted me to scream and throw plates. She wanted me to fall to my knees and beg for my place in the family. But I gave her absolutely nothing. I just stared at her with a chilling calm that made her arrogant smile slowly fade away. I was not looking at a sister-in-law anymore. I was looking at a co-conspirator in a massive financial fraud. I realized something incredibly valuable in that moment. Audrey was married to Jamal, the chief financial officer of the company. Jamal was a strictly principled man who often clashed with the Preston family's greedy behavior. Audrey was so busy gloating that she did not realize she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed. If the whole family was conspiring to commit wire fraud by deceiving investors, then Jamal was the one legally signing those fraudulent documents. They were setting her own husband up to take the fall. I finally spoke. My voice was dangerously soft and steady. I thanked her for stopping by and sharing such fascinating information. I told her the door was behind her and she could let herself out. Audrey looked deeply unsettled by my complete lack of emotion. She scoffed, muttered something about me being a creepy loser, and aggressively turned around. Her heels clicked rapidly across the floor, and she slammed the front door behind her. I was completely alone again. The silence in the house felt entirely different now. It was no longer the silence of a lonely housewife. It was the silence of a hunter locking onto a target. The entire family had sold my soul for a taste of billionaire wealth. They thought they had buried me alive. They did not know I was a seed and I was about to tear their entire foundation apart. Tomorrow morning, I was going to pay a very special visit to my brother-in-law, Jamal. I stood in the dark living room listening to the sound of my sister-in-law's car speeding away into the night. The massive house fell into a dead silence. Ryan was fast asleep upstairs, completely confident that his cruel threats and financial control had broken my spirit. He actually thought I was curled up in some corner crying and mourning my miserable fate. But tears hold absolutely zero legal weight in a divorce battle, and they certainly would not save me from being thrown out onto the street with nothing. I am a forensic accountant. When someone tries to bury me, I do not cry. I start digging. I walked up the grand staircase, stepping very carefully to avoid the wooden floorboards that I knew would creak. I walked right past the master bedroom, where my husband of 7 years was sleeping peacefully, and went straight to his locked home office at the end of the hall. Ryan always bragged about his state-of-the-art security systems, but he was a software visionary, not an auditor. He frequently used a predictable string of passwords involving the company founding date and numbers he considered lucky. It was incredibly pathetic that a man preparing for a multi-million-dollar initial public offering had such sloppy personal security habits. It took me less than 2 minutes to bypass his personal firewall and gain full administrative access to his hard drive. The monitor glowed in the dark, casting a pale light across my face. If I were an average betrayed wife, I probably would have frantically searched for hidden folders containing intimate photos, romantic text messages, or secret hotel bookings between him and Vanessa. But I did not care about their dirty little romance. In the world of corporate fraud, love rarely leaves a clear paper trail, but greed always does. The golden rule of forensic accounting is to follow the money, and that is exactly what I started to do. I opened the internal financial reports, the draft filings for the upcoming public offering, and the synchronized bank statements Ryan kept on his personal desktop. At first glance, everything looked absolutely perfect. The books were neatly balanced, the liabilities were under control, and the cash flow appeared abundant. But I never looked just at the surface. I started cross-referencing the operational expenses over the last 6 months, exactly matching the timeline when Vanessa suddenly changed her name in the human resources system. My eyes scanned through thousands of data points, and then I spotted the anomaly. There was a recurring series of massive payments categorized as strategic consulting fees and software licensing transfers. These funds were not going to our usual tech partners. They were steadily flowing into the bank accounts of a limited liability company called Horizon Ventures. It was a perfectly structured shell company registered in the state of Delaware, a place notorious for protecting the identities of corporate owners. The payments were divided into smaller amounts and transferred systematically. It was clever enough to bypass a regular corporate accountant, but it could never escape the eyes of the woman who used to clean up Ryan's financial messes from day one. I dug deeper into his private cloud network, tracing the tax identification numbers and the registration documents for Horizon Ventures. And then I found the Holy Grail. I opened the scanned copies of the company formation contracts and the bank authorization forms. The sole owner of this shell company, the person holding absolute control over the millions of dollars being siphoned out of the main corporation, was none other than Vanessa Montgomery. A cold chill ran down my spine as I pieced the entire puzzle together. This was not just a cheating scandal or a crazy public relations strategy. This was an organized financial fraud and asset concealment scheme. Ryan knew that after the company went public, I would have a legal right to claim half of that massive wealth in a divorce. So he and Vanessa orchestrated a brilliant stage play. They used the fake marriage narrative to fool the investors and inflate the company valuation to astronomical heights. Simultaneously, they were quietly draining the company cash and funneling it into Vanessa's private fund. Ryan's plan was crystal clear. He was going to file for divorce right before or right after the public offering, forcing me to walk away with a tiny settlement, while the vast majority of his actual wealth was hidden safely under his mistress's name. I smiled a very cold smile that held absolutely no warmth. Ryan thought he could cut off my financial access and throw me out on the street. He did not realize he had just handed me the execution warrant for his entire career. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a military-grade encrypted hard drive, a device I always kept from my days working at the major accounting firm. I plugged it into Ryan's computer and initiated the data transfer protocol. I downloaded absolutely everything. I took every single bank statement, every wire transfer receipt, every email discussing the formation of the shell company, and the complete registration files for Horizon Ventures. I also backed up the original, unaltered financial reports. Every single file that transferred onto my drive was another nail in the coffin for Ryan's empire. The download process took 20 agonizing minutes, but I sat there with absolute patience. I was currently holding the hard evidence for securities fraud, investor deception, and corporate embezzlement. When the progress bar finally hit 100%, I safely ejected the hard drive and tucked it securely into my chest pocket. The cold weight of the metal casing pressing against my skin gave me absolute peace of mind. I meticulously wiped all traces of my access from his computer, cleared the temporary cache, and put the system back into perfect hibernation. Nobody, not even a top-tier information technology expert, could ever prove I had been inside that machine. I walked out of the home office and closed the door as quietly as a ghost. Ryan was still fast asleep, snoring softly from the master bedroom. He was probably dreaming about ringing the bell at the stock exchange and swimming in millions of dollars. He had absolutely no idea that his obedient suburban housewife had just stripped away his entire arsenal. I walked back down to the living room and sat in the dark. I now held the most powerful cards in the deck. It was no longer the time to play defense. It was time to plan a devastating offensive strike. I knew exactly which ally I needed to visit first thing tomorrow morning. His name was Jamal. He was the chief financial officer of the company and my brother-in-law. Jamal was a strictly principled man who had always clashed with the family and their greedy tendencies. I knew Ryan was using Jamal's signature to authorize these fraudulent transfers, effectively setting him up to take the fall if the federal investigators ever looked into the books. If I showed Jamal these documents, he would realize his own brother-in-law was pushing him toward a federal prison sentence. Ryan thought he had a flawless plan, but he made the fatal mistake of underestimating the people he stepped on. I sat in the dark, feeling a sense of absolute clarity. The tears were gone. The heartbreak was replaced by cold, calculated logic. I was going to let him continue his arrogant performance just a little bit longer. Let him put on his expensive suits and smile for the cameras. Because when the time was right, I was going to tear down his fragile house of cards in front of the entire world. The morning after I copied the entire financial history of my husband's company, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. When I answered, a crisp, highly polished voice spoke on the other end. It was Vanessa Montgomery. She did not sound like a woman who was secretly sleeping with a married man. She sounded like a high-powered corporate executive arranging a minor business transaction. She told me we needed to have a brief, pragmatic conversation and instructed me to meet her at an exclusive private cafe downtown. She did not ask if I was available. She simply stated the time and hung up the phone. I did not feel angry. I actually felt a deep sense of calm anticipation. I chose a simple, elegant dress, applied a light touch of makeup, and drove into the city. When I walked into the upscale cafe, Vanessa was already seated at a corner table, perfectly isolated from the rest of the room. She looked exactly like her human resources profile picture, but even more polished in person. She was wearing a tailored white blazer and a pair of diamond earrings that I immediately recognized. Ryan had bought those earrings last month and told me they were a gift for his mother. Seeing them on Vanessa's ears only confirmed how deep his deception ran and how little he respected our marriage. I approached the table and sat down across from her. She did not offer to buy me coffee or exchange any pleasantries. She just looked at me with a mixture of pity and supreme arrogance. Vanessa leaned forward and folded her perfectly manicured hands on the table. She began speaking in a low, steady tone, treating me like a naive child who needed to be explained the harsh realities of the world. She told me that she knew about my little visit to the Human Resources office yesterday and that she completely understood why I was upset. But then she quickly shifted into a ruthless corporate negotiation. She explicitly told me that Ryan was a visionary genius who belonged on the global stage and that I was simply a relic from his humble past. She said the tech industry demanded a certain caliber of presence and sophistication. According to her, I was just a quiet suburban housewife who would only drag him down while she was his intellectual equal and the true partner he deserved. She spoke about my marriage as if it were an expired business contract that needed to be terminated for the sake of efficiency. She proudly claimed that she had been the one standing beside Ryan during the most critical investor meetings. She boasted about how easily she slipped into the role of the modern tech wife, and how the wealthy venture capitalists adored her. She actually had the nerve to look me right in the eye and say that Ryan had finally chosen someone worthy of his massive empire. She said he needed a woman who understood the complex machinery of Silicon Valley, not a woman who stayed home baking cookies and folding laundry. She painted a picture where my sacrifices meant absolutely nothing, and her corporate manipulation was the only thing holding the company together. I sat there listening to her arrogant monologue without interrupting a single word. I did not glare at her. I did not raise my voice or cause a scene in the quiet, sophisticated cafe. I just observed her the way an experienced auditor observes a massive discrepancy on a fraudulent balance sheet. Vanessa mistook my quiet demeanor for submission. She smiled a victorious little smile and reached into her expensive designer handbag. She pulled out a sleek leather checkbook, grabbed a heavy gold pen, and quickly wrote out a check. She slid the piece of paper across the smooth wooden table, stopping right in front of me. I looked down at the check. It was made out to me for $100,000. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and crossed her legs, looking incredibly pleased with herself. She told me that this was a very generous severance package. She instructed me to take the money file for a quiet, uncontested divorce and walk away without making any noise. She warned me that if I tried to fight Ryan in court, his corporate lawyers would drag the legal process out for years and drain every single penny I had to my name. She promised that if I just accepted my defeat gracefully, I could start a nice new life somewhere far away from their elite billionaire circle. She spoke with the absolute certainty of a woman who believed she had already won the war. I stared at the check for a long moment. $100,000. To an ordinary housewife, it might have seemed like a lot of money or a devastating insult to a 7-year marriage. But to a forensic accountant who had just spent the entire night analyzing a massive web of corporate fraud, it was nothing but a pathetic joke. Vanessa really thought she could buy my silence and erase my existence with a fraction of the millions they were currently stealing from the company investors. I slowly reached out and picked up the check. Vanessa smiled wider, fully believing that I had accepted her dirty bribe. Instead of putting it in my purse, I deliberately gripped the edges of the thick paper. With a slow, steady motion, I tore the check right down the middle. Then I stacked the halves and tore them again. I kept tearing until the generous severance package was nothing but tiny pieces of worthless paper. I dropped the confetti onto the table right in front of her perfectly manicured hands. Vanessa's victorious smile instantly vanished. Her eyes widened and her jaw tightened in absolute fury. She opened her mouth to speak, probably to threaten me with absolute financial ruin, but I did not give her the chance to say another word. I leaned across the small table, bringing my face very close to hers. I kept my voice incredibly low, almost a whisper, but I made sure every single syllable was sharp, cold, and perfectly clear. I told her she was going to need that money for her legal defense team. She looked confused and angry for a fraction of a second. Then I leaned in closer and whispered a specific sequence of numbers. It was the exact routing and account number for Horizon Ventures, the secret shell company registered in Delaware. I softly mentioned the precise amount of the last wire transfer that had been funneled into that offshore account just 3 days ago. I also whispered the exact date she had filed the corporate paperwork under her own name. The transformation on Vanessa's face was immediate and absolute. The arrogant, glowing confidence completely washed out of her skin, leaving her looking as pale as a ghost. Her perfect posture collapsed, and she slumped back into her chair, as if she had been physically struck. Her eyes darted around the room in pure panic, as if she expected the federal authorities to walk through the cafe doors at any second to arrest her. She was no longer looking at a naive suburban housewife. She realized she was sitting across from someone who had just discovered her highly illegal offshore vault and possessed the power to send her to federal prison. I stood up from the table, smoothing out my dress with complete composure. I looked down at the woman who had stolen my identity, my husband's loyalty, and millions of investor dollars. I calmly advised her to enjoy playing the role of Mrs. Preston while it lasted, because the stage was about to collapse beneath her feet. I turned around and walked out of the cafe, leaving her trembling alone with the torn pieces of her pathetic bribe. The war had officially escalated, and I was ready to pull the final trigger. Later that same week, my father-in-law hosted his 60th birthday party at their sprawling luxury estate. It was not just a regular family gathering. It was a carefully curated networking event, heavily disguised as a personal celebration. The exclusive guest list included the most prominent venture capitalists, leading tech journalists, and wealthy angel investors in the city. These were the exact same people Ryan was desperately trying to impress before the upcoming initial public offering. I arrived at the estate wearing a simple but elegant black dress. I did not ride in the same car as Ryan. He had left our house hours earlier, claiming he needed to help his parents set up the catering and manage the event staff. But I knew exactly who he was actually picking up and bringing to the party. When I walked through the massive double mahogany doors of the estate, the sheer audacity of their family deception hit me right in the face. The grand ballroom was filled with wealthy people holding expensive champagne flutes, laughing and exchanging business cards. And standing right there in the absolute center of the room under the glowing crystal chandelier was my husband Ryan. His arm was wrapped securely and affectionately around Vanessa's waist. She was wearing a stunning designer gown dripping in diamonds and charming a group of elderly key investors. My mother-in-law was standing right next to them, beaming with absolute pride and introducing Vanessa to everyone as her brilliant and beautiful daughter-in-law. I stood at the edge of the crowded room watching the people who were supposed to be my loyal family parade my husband's mistress around as his legal wife. I felt a sharp tap on my shoulder. I turned around and saw my father-in-law. He did not look happy to see me at all. He grabbed my arm with a tight, uncomfortable grip and quickly pulled me into a dark side hallway, completely away from the main party and the watching eyes. My mother-in-law noticed us and immediately rushed over, leaving Ryan and Vanessa to continue entertaining the important guests. My mother-in-law looked at me with pure panic and intense anger in her eyes. She hissed at me, asking what on earth I was doing here. She said Ryan had explicitly told me to stay home tonight, so I would not cause any unnecessary drama. I calmly pulled my arm away from my father-in-law and reminded her that I was still legally married to her son and that I had every right to attend my father-in-law's birthday dinner. She looked at me with absolute disgust. She told me I was being entirely selfish and that my stubborn presence was going to ruin the most important night of Ryan's entire corporate career. She frantically explained that the lead investors from New York were in the room and they had already bonded with Vanessa under the impression that she was the devoted wife. My father-in-law pointed a warning finger directly at my face. He told me in a low, threatening voice that if I cared about this family and our financial future at all, I would turn around and walk out the front door right now. I stared at both of them with a cold, blank expression and flatly refused. I told them I drove all the way here and I was going to stay for dinner. They looked at each other, realizing they could not physically throw me out of the house without causing a massive scene in front of the tech journalists. So my mother-in-law came up with a cruel and humiliating compromise. She grabbed my elbow and dragged me into the grand dining room before the guests sat down. She pointed to a tiny small table in the far dark corner, right next to the swinging kitchen doors. It was the overflow table, usually reserved for the catering staff and the younger annoying cousins. She explicitly ordered me to sit at that small table and remain completely invisible for the rest of the night. She strictly forbade me from speaking to any of the business guests or the investors. She told me that if anyone happened to ask who I was supposed to lie and say I was a distant relative visiting from out of town. She looked me dead in the eye and said I needed to swallow my pride and save Ryan's face in front of the important people because his tech success was the only thing keeping a luxury roof over my head. They were humiliating me in the most degrading way possible, actively trying to make me feel small, useless, and insignificant in a room full of billionaires. I did not argue. I walked over to the small table in the shadows and sat down. I watched as the wealthy guests filed into the dining room and took their seats. Ryan and Vanessa sat at the magnificent head table with my parents-in-law laughing, touching hands, and clinking their expensive crystal glasses. I sat quietly in the corner eating my catered food and analyzing the entire disgusting performance. They really thought they had won. They thought putting me in the corner would break my spirit, humiliate me into submission, and keep my mouth shut. But they had absolutely no idea that the quiet housewife sitting next to the kitchen doors was currently holding the encrypted hard drive containing all of their illegal offshore bank accounts and fraudulent wire transfers. As the lavish dinner came to an end, it was time for the evening toasts. My father-in-law stood up and gave a long, passionate speech about strong family values and building a lasting legacy. Then Ryan stood up holding his tall champagne glass. He gave a highly charismatic and practiced speech about the glorious future of his tech company. He then turned to Vanessa, looked deeply into her eyes, and thanked his beautiful partner for standing by his side through the hardest times of building the business. The entire dining room erupted into loud applause. Vanessa smiled brightly and leaned in to kiss him on the cheek for the cameras. As the applause slowly died down and the room grew quiet, I slowly stood up from my chair in the dark corner. I picked up my glass of sparkling water and picked up my silver spoon. I tapped the metal against the glass. The sharp ringing sound echoed loudly through the massive dining room. Every single head in the room turned to look at me standing in the shadows. Ryan's arrogant face instantly dropped. My mother-in-law gripped her chest looking like she was about to faint. Vanessa completely froze in her seat, her fake smile vanishing instantly. I walked a few steps forward out of the shadows, so the entire room and every single investor could see me clearly. I raised my water glass and projected my voice perfectly so everyone could hear me. I said I would also like to propose a very special toast to Ryan and his incredibly creative executive team. I smiled a very sharp and chilling smile that made the room temperature feel like it had dropped. I said I wanted to toast to the absolute truth and to the fascinating things that happen when you look very closely at the hidden financial numbers. I turned my head and looked directly into Vanessa's terrified eyes. I raised my glass slightly higher and said, I want to toast to Horizon Ventures and to the federal authorities who always manage to catch up with brilliant corporate fraudsters. I looked at Ryan and said, May your impending federal court dates be as glamorous and well-attended as this lovely birthday party. The silence in the grand dining room was absolute and completely deafening. The wealthy investors looked deeply confused and started whispering frantically to each other. Horizon Ventures was the secret Delaware shell company they were using to embezzle the money, and I had just dropped its exact name right in front of the very people they were trying to defraud. Ryan turned completely white. He looked like he had literally stopped breathing. My father-in-law dropped his cloth napkin and gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. I did not wait for them to respond or defend themselves. I did not yell, cry, or throw my glass. I simply took a slow sip of my water, set the glass down gently on the nearest table, and calmly walked toward the exit. I could hear the panicked whispers and urgent questions erupting behind me as the investors started demanding Ryan explain what I was talking about. I walked out the heavy front doors into the cool night air, feeling a massive wave of absolute power rushing through my veins. I had just lit the match, and now I was going to sit back and watch their entire fake corporate empire burn straight to the ground. The next morning, I woke up very early, long before the sun even tried to peek through the heavy curtains in my bedroom. I knew exactly where I needed to go, and exactly who I needed to see. My target was not an expensive divorce lawyer or a private investigator. The person I needed to meet was Jamal, the chief financial officer of the company, and Ryan's brother-in-law. Jamal was a brilliant and highly principled black man who had built his own success from the ground up. He earned his Master of Business Administration from a top-tier university and always operated with absolute integrity. However, in the eyes of the Preston family, he was constantly looked down upon. Audrey, his wife, and Ryan's sister frequently criticized him in public during family dinners. They always treated him like a lucky charity case who was allowed to step into their wealthy elite world through marriage. Ryan never truly respected Jamal and only appointed him to the chief financial officer position because he desperately needed someone with a spotless record and a cautious personality to appease the strict venture capitalists. I knew Jamal's daily routine perfectly. He always went to a small, quiet coffee shop near the corporate headquarters at exactly 7 in the morning to review the daily financial reports before heading into the office. When I walked into the cafe, I saw him sitting at a secluded corner table, his eyes intensely focused on his laptop screen. I walked over, pulled out the chair across from him, and sat down. Jamal looked up at me with absolute surprise. He asked me what I was doing there so early, and his tone was noticeably guarded. He had undoubtedly heard all about the massive scene at the birthday party last night. The Preston family had probably spun a horrible narrative about me losing my mind, or trying to sabotage the company out of pure jealous rage. He looked at me like I was a ticking time bomb ready to explode in the middle of his quiet morning routine. I did not waste time with small talk or emotional apologies. I looked straight into his eyes and told him I needed him to listen to me as a chief financial officer right now, and not as my brother-in-law. I explicitly stated that the company was standing on the absolute edge of a massive legal catastrophe, and he was the one who was going to take the entire fall for it if he did not act immediately. Jamal frowned, closed his laptop slightly, and crossed his arms over his chest. He defensively told me that Ryan had already warned him that I might come looking for him to stir up trouble. He advised me to go back home and let the lawyers handle our marital issues instead of dragging him into a messy family war. He firmly stated that he had a massive initial public offering to manage, and he could not afford to get involved in personal drama. I did not get angry at his defensive attitude. I completely understood why he wanted to stay away from the Preston family chaos. I calmly reached into my leather bag and pulled out the military-grade encrypted hard drive that I had copied last night. I plugged it into his laptop and typed in the administrative password. I opened the folder containing the real internal financial reports, the actual documents that Ryan had not altered yet. I pushed the laptop back toward Jamal and instructed him to look very closely at the revenue columns for the last 3 financial quarters. I told him to look at the numbers and tell me if they matched the reports he had been signing. Jamal let out a frustrated sigh, acting reluctant, but his natural instincts as a financial expert forced him to look at the screen. Initially, his eyes just skimmed over the numbers casually, but a few seconds later, his entire body went completely rigid. His eyes widened and locked onto the data. He started scrolling much faster, his fingers trembling slightly as they flew across the trackpad. He was looking at the naked truth. The company revenue had been artificially inflated by 3 times its actual value by logging fake contracts and massive advance payments that had never actually materialized. But the thing that truly terrified Jamal was not just the fabricated revenue numbers. What made him break out in a cold sweat were the next files I opened for him. I clicked on the corporate registration files for the shell company that Ryan and Vanessa had created. I showed him exactly how millions of dollars in liquid company cash were being funneled offshore under the guise of strategic consulting fees and the true beneficiaries hiding behind those accounts. I pointed directly at Vanessa's name on the ownership documents. I quietly reminded Jamal that as the chief financial officer, his signature was on every single financial statement submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission and every single corporate tax return. Ryan had been incredibly cunning by separating himself from the direct financial approval processes. He used his power as the chief executive officer to pressure Jamal into signing off on documents without ever letting him see the complete hidden financial picture. I lowered my voice and told Jamal the most cruel truth of all. I told him that Ryan never respected him. Ryan and the Preston family had always despised him, and now they were actively using him as their sacrificial lamb. When the initial public offering launched, and the federal authorities eventually conducted their independent audits, they would absolutely discover this massive black hole. And when that happened, Ryan would stand in front of the board of directors, act completely innocent, and blame everything on his chief financial officer. Ryan would claim that Jamal had embezzled the money and forged the books on his own. They were going to send him to federal prison for decades, while Ryan and Vanessa escaped with millions of dollars safely tucked away in offshore accounts. And Audrey, the wife he always tried so hard to please, would immediately divorce him to protect the family assets from any legal trouble. Jamal sat completely frozen in his chair, his face turning a pale shade of gray from the absolute shock. He was a proud man who always believed that hard work and honesty would bring him the respect he deserved. Now he realized he was being ruthlessly framed by his own in-laws. His hands clenched into tight fists until his knuckles turned white. He looked up at me, and his eyes were burning with a mixture of pure rage and sudden awakening. The illusion of his perfect corporate life had just shattered into a million pieces. He asked me exactly what I needed him to do to stop this disaster. I told him I did not need him to resign or cause a massive scene right now. I needed him to go back into that office and continue playing the role of the obedient chief financial officer. I needed him to quietly collect every single signature, every internal memo, and every email directive from Ryan regarding the wire transfers to the shell companies. I needed him to be my eyes and ears inside the executive boardroom to guarantee that we had bulletproof evidence when their judgment day finally arrived. I told him we had to build an airtight case that the federal investigators could not ignore. Jamal did not hesitate for a single second. He nodded his head with absolute determination. He said the Preston family had treated him like an outsider for years, and now they were trying to make him their scapegoat. He promised to help me tear down this entire fraudulent scheme to protect his own freedom and integrity. We sat there in the quiet coffee shop mapping out our exact next moves. Ryan thought he could outsmart everyone with his supreme arrogance. But he made a fatal mistake when he forced the two smartest and most principled people he had ever stepped on to join forces against him. A real reckoning was about to begin, and we were going to collapse his empire from the very inside out. A few days after the disastrous birthday party, the real retaliation began. Ryan always prided himself on maintaining absolute control over every single aspect of his life. When he realized that I was no longer his obedient silent puppet, he decided to launch a devastating attack on what he firmly believed was my absolute weakest point: my financial dependency. He thought a woman who had willingly stepped back to be a stay-at-home wife for 5 long years would completely collapse without her husband's premium credit cards. He genuinely believed that stripping away my financial lifeline would force me to beg for his forgiveness, and accept a quiet divorce with absolutely nothing, while he and his fake wife enjoyed his massive upcoming fortune. He had absolutely no idea that trying to cut off my money was like trying to drown a fish in the ocean. That sunny morning, I had a routine medical appointment at an exclusive private clinic located in the most expensive district downtown. This was the pristine luxury healthcare facility I always visited, and the exorbitant costs were always automatically billed to the premium corporate health insurance plan provided by Ryan's company for the executive board families. I walked into the beautifully decorated lobby, checking in with my usual quiet demeanor. After my comprehensive examination, I walked up to the polished reception desk to collect my necessary prescriptions and confirm my next appointment schedule. The receptionist, a friendly woman who always greeted me with a bright, warm smile, suddenly looked extremely confused as she stared at her computer screen. She typed a few more keys, her brow furrowing in deep concentration, and then she looked up at me with deep pity and uncomfortable hesitation in her eyes. She softly informed me that my premium health insurance card had just been declined by the provider. She explained that the corporate human resources system had automatically removed my name from the executive benefits registry at exactly midnight the night before. I stood there in complete silence, but my analytical mind was working at lightning speed. Ryan did not just freeze our shared household credit cards. He was so incredibly ruthless and vindictive that he actually canceled my medical insurance coverage without a single word of warning. He wanted to send a very clear and terrifying message that my basic right to exist and my right to essential healthcare depended entirely on his generous mercy. Right at that humiliating moment, the phone inside my leather purse vibrated sharply. I pulled it out and saw a new text message from Ryan. The message was short, cold, and dripping with absolute supreme arrogance. He formally informed me that all of our shared credit accounts and corporate benefits had been temporarily frozen for strict security reasons ahead of the initial public offering. He then had the absolute unmitigated audacity to advise me that if I needed money for basic groceries or unexpected medical bills, I should call his personal assistant and beg for an allowance. He wrote that he might consider sending me a small amount of cash if I promised to behave myself, stay locked inside the house, and never show up at another important corporate event ever again. The receptionist cleared her throat nervously, breaking the heavy, suffocating silence at the front desk. She printed out a very long, detailed invoice and quietly explained that since the corporate insurance policy was no longer active, I would have to pay the entire bill for the doctor's examination, the extensive laboratory tests, and the premium medication entirely out of pocket. The total amount printed at the bottom of the page was over $3,000. She looked at me with obvious deep sympathy, probably assuming I was just another discarded wealthy wife who was suddenly left with absolutely nothing in the middle of a public lobby. A few other well-dressed wealthy patients sitting in the plush waiting area started turning their heads to look at us, sensing the awkward tension. They were silently waiting to see if I would start crying hysterically, call my husband to make a massive, desperate scene, or simply run out of the luxury clinic in complete, absolute shame. If I were the naive, trusting woman I was 5 years ago, I probably would have panicked, felt my chest tighten, and started crying right there in the lobby. But the woman standing at that reception desk today was the legal sole owner of a highly powerful shadow venture capital firm. When Ryan and I first got married, I inherited a massive sum of money from my late grandfather, who was a quiet but incredibly successful real estate tycoon. I never told Ryan about this massive inheritance because I wanted him to build his own success and not rely on my family wealth to fund his tech dreams. I secretly used that exact inheritance money to establish an anonymous venture capital firm, and that firm was the exact entity that provided the initial lifeline funding to save Ryan's failing company when he was desperate and bankrupt 5 years ago. Over the years, that initial investment money had multiplied dozens of times and was strictly managed by a highly exclusive private wealth bank in Switzerland. I smiled a very calm, polite, and unshaken smile at the nervous receptionist. I gently told her that it was not a problem at all, and that the sudden insurance issue was simply a minor administrative error on the corporate human resources side that I would sort out later. I slowly opened my designer leather wallet. I completely ignored the shiny platinum credit cards with Ryan's name on them that were now nothing but completely useless pieces of plastic. Instead, I bypassed the main slots, opened a hidden zipper compartment in the back, and pulled out a solid, heavy metal card. It was completely pitch black. It did not have the colorful logo of any standard commercial bank, it had no credit limit printed on the front, and it featured absolutely zero flashy designs. It was an ultra-exclusive black card, the specific kind that is only issued to elite clients with hundreds of millions of dollars in verified liquid assets and requires a direct personal invitation from the bank board of directors. The heavy weight of the solid metal card made a sharp, distinct clacking sound as I set it down on the glass counter. I pushed it gently toward the receptionist and calmly asked her to charge the entire medical bill to that specific account. The receptionist picked up the card, and her eyes widened slightly at the unnatural heavy weight of the solid metal. She carefully inserted it into the digital payment terminal, half expecting it to be declined. There was no error beep, and absolutely no delay for fraud verification. The banking system immediately spit out the approved receipt in less than a single second. I took the heavy silver pen, signed my name on the receipt with absolute precision, took my black card back, and tucked it safely into the hidden compartment of my wallet. I grabbed my small prescription bags, nodded politely to the stunned receptionist, and walked out of the luxury clinic with my head held extremely high. The curious, judgmental stares from the other patients in the waiting room immediately darted away as I walked past them with total confidence. When I finally got into my car in the parking lot, I did not start the engine right away. I pulled out my phone and reopened Ryan's arrogant, threatening text message. He was undoubtedly sitting in his luxurious executive corner office right now, sipping an expensive imported coffee and imagining me crying in total despair because I could not pay a simple medical bill. He actually thought he was a powerful king holding my entire financial life in his hands. He had absolutely no idea that his entire corporate bank account, compared to my actual hidden net worth, was like a single drop of water in a massive, deep ocean. I typed out a single brief reply to his threatening message. I told him to keep his little platinum credit cards to help fund his upcoming drastic lifestyle changes, and I sincerely hoped he had enough liquid cash saved up in his personal accounts to pay for his elite criminal defense team in the very near future. I hit the send button, tossed the phone onto the passenger leather seat, and smiled a genuine smile as I pressed the gas pedal. His cheap psychological control game had failed completely. He wanted to break my spirit and force me into submission, but he only accidentally reinforced the massive explosive bomb I was meticulously preparing to drop on his entire empire of lies. 2 days after the incident at the medical clinic, Ryan decided to escalate his psychological warfare to an entirely new level of cruelty. He realized that freezing my credit cards and cutting off my health insurance did not make me fall to my knees and beg for his mercy like he had arrogantly imagined. Because his financial chokehold had completely failed, he decided to attack the one place he thought would finally break my spirit. He wanted to throw me out of the very house we had shared for the last 7 years. It was a massive, beautiful home that I had personally designed and decorated, but on the legal paperwork, it was entirely owned by his technology corporation. It was late in the morning, and I was sitting quietly in the living room, drinking a cup of tea and reviewing the confidential financial documents that Jamal had secretly emailed to me. Suddenly, a series of loud, aggressive knocks echoed through the front hallway, shattering the silence of the house. It was not the polite knock of a delivery driver or a friendly neighbor stopping by. It was the heavy, demanding knock of someone trying to establish absolute authority. I calmly set my teacup down on the table, stood up slowly, and walked over to open the heavy mahogany door. Standing on my front porch were two uniformed police officers with their badges shining and their tactical gear fully equipped. Standing right behind them, at a safe, comfortable distance, was Ryan. He was wearing an expensive, custom-tailored suit with his hands buried deep in his pockets, smiling with the supreme arrogance of a king who was about to execute a helpless traitor. One of the police officers stepped forward and asked me in a flat, cold tone if I was Naomi Preston. When I nodded to confirm my identity, he handed me a thick stack of legal documents stamped with a bright red court seal. He explained in a highly professional and detached voice that this was an official eviction notice, and it was effective immediately. He stated that this property was legally registered as a corporate asset, and the executive board of directors had officially signed a resolution to revoke my residential access. The officer added that because my name was not on any of the personal ownership deeds, I was technically trespassing on private corporate property. He told me I had exactly 1 hour to go back inside, pack my most essential personal belongings, and vacate the premises. He made it incredibly clear that if I refused to cooperate or tried to resist, they would be legally forced to place me in handcuffs and escort me into the back of their police cruiser for obstructing law enforcement. Ryan took a few steps forward, pushing his way between the two police officers. He looked at me with eyes full of mockery, fake pity, and absolute victory. He told me that he had warned me not to fight him or try to outsmart him. He said I had stubbornly chosen the hardest possible path, and now I had to pay a very heavy price for my ridiculous arrogance. He even had the sheer audacity to play the role of a merciful husband in front of the authorities, claiming he had ordered a rideshare car to wait by the front gate to take me to a cheap motel somewhere on the outskirts of the city. He desperately wanted to see me completely break down. He wanted me to scream, cry hysterically, cling to the doorframe, and beg him not to throw me out onto the street with absolutely nothing. He did not call the police because he actually thought I was a violent physical threat. He brought the police here because he wanted to use the power of the law to publicly humiliate me and crush my dignity in front of the entire neighborhood. I stood there in complete silence, holding the heavy eviction documents in my hands, and slowly looked up right into Ryan's smug, self-satisfied face. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream panic or yell obscenities at him. I simply smiled, a very calm, polite, and freezing cold smile that actually made his own confident grin falter for a split second. I turned my attention back to the police officers and told them they did not need to wait around for an hour. I told them I had completely anticipated his pathetic, cowardly move, and I had been fully prepared for this exact moment for several days. I turned around, walked back into the main hallway, and pulled out a medium-sized suitcase that I had neatly packed the night before. I did not take any of the expensive furniture, the designer jewelry, or any of the luxury items Ryan had bought with stolen corporate funds. I only packed my simple clothes, my personal identification documents, and most importantly, the military-grade encrypted hard drive containing every single piece of evidence proving his massive financial crimes. When I rolled the suitcase out to the front door, Ryan's expression shifted from arrogant victory to genuine confusion. My absolute unnatural calmness and total lack of emotional devastation made him feel incredibly uneasy. He frowned, and his eyes darted around trying to find any small sign of fear or defeat in my posture, but he found absolutely nothing. I stepped out onto the marble porch standing directly in front of him. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him in a very soft but razor-sharp whisper that this massive house was going to feel incredibly large and terribly empty for a man who was about to spend the rest of his life in a tiny, filthy cell at a federal penitentiary. Ryan flinched, stepped backward, and let out a forced, awkward laugh, loudly calling me a delusional, paranoid psychopath. He aggressively told me to get off his property and out of his sight immediately. I completely ignored his childish insults. Before I walked down the final step, I paused and gently placed a very thick brown paper envelope on the small decorative console table right next to the front door. I looked at Ryan and told him I had left him a very special parting gift. I highly recommended that he open it and read every single page very carefully before he and Vanessa rushed to pop open their expensive champagne to celebrate their imaginary victory. Then I politely nodded goodbye to the two confused police officers, rolled my suitcase straight to my older car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back at that house a single time. In my rearview mirror, I could clearly see the exact moment Ryan rushed over to the table and aggressively ripped open the thick brown envelope. He probably thought it was a desperate letter begging for forgiveness, or a signed divorce settlement, agreeing to walk away with nothing. But the document inside that envelope was an official civil court subpoena issued by the state Supreme Court. While he was busy stroking his own massive ego and planning this theatrical eviction, the elite corporate legal team I had hired using my secret black card had finished filing the emergency injunction. It was not a standard divorce petition fighting over household assets. It was a massive civil lawsuit aimed directly at Ryan and Vanessa, personally charging them with orchestrated marital fraud, systemic financial deception, and conspiracy to conceal corporate assets. This lawsuit was perfectly and ruthlessly designed by my legal team. It immediately triggered a hard freeze on all of his personal bank accounts and corporate assets, blocking any attempt to wire money offshore. Most importantly, it legally demanded that the entire executive board of directors appear in court to testify under oath. I watched Ryan freeze on the porch like a stone statue as the court summons slipped from his hands and fluttered down onto the perfectly manicured lawn. The two police officers stood next to him, looking at him with deep suspicion. The arrogant hunter suddenly realized he had just locked himself inside an inescapable steel trap. He thought he had successfully kicked me out of a worthless house, but in reality, I had just completely stripped away his entire future, his reputation, and his freedom. The civil lawsuit hit them like a massive runaway freight train. The emergency injunction filed by my elite legal team immediately froze the Delaware Shell Company and placed a severe lock on all executive financial transfers. I knew Vanessa was in an absolute state of sheer panic. She was a woman who had built her entire fake persona on the illusion of absolute power and sudden total control, but now she found herself completely trapped. But rats cornered in a trap do not just surrender gracefully to their fate. They bite back with everything they have. Vanessa quickly realized she could not possibly win in a sterile courtroom where hard financial numbers and sworn legal testimonies were strictly required. So she decided to wage her desperate war in the court of public opinion. She used the massive public relations budget of the company to secure an exclusive front-page feature in one of the most prestigious tech business magazines in Silicon Valley. 3 days after the dramatic eviction, I was sitting on the spacious balcony of my new luxury apartment, sipping a cup of dark black coffee and scrolling through my digital tablet. There it was, right on the digital front cover of the publication. A high-definition, professionally lit photograph of Ryan and Vanessa, sitting on a sleek leather sofa holding hands and looking lovingly into each other's eyes. The bold headline read, "The Power Couple, Redefining the Future of Streaming Technology." I read through the lengthy article, and I had to genuinely admire her sheer absolute audacity and total lack of shame. Vanessa spun a beautiful, heartbreaking, and entirely fabricated story for the naive journalist. She talked extensively about the sleepless nights she supposedly spent in a tiny freezing garage, helping Ryan code the initial software architecture. She shamelessly stole my actual real memories. She described the exact cheap meals I used to cook for him when we were broke, and presented those intimate details to the world as her own dedicated, loving sacrifices. But she did not stop at simply stealing my marital history to build her fake executive profile. She had to address the swirling rumors of the massive lawsuit without actually telling the public the truth. In the middle of the glowing interview, the journalist asked about the recent whispers of legal troubles ahead of the highly anticipated initial public offering. Vanessa put on a perfectly practiced face of deep sorrow and profound disappointment. She claimed that sadly, whenever a revolutionary tech company reaches a $1 billion valuation, it naturally attracts greedy individuals looking for a quick, unearned payout. She specifically mentioned that a highly unstable, disgruntled former associate of the family was currently attempting to extort the company with completely baseless and malicious allegations. She masterfully portrayed herself and Ryan as the innocent victims of a cruel blackmail scheme designed to ruin their glorious life work. She practically begged the venture capitalists and the general public to stand by them against this terrible extortion attempt. The tech community completely swallowed her beautiful lies without a single question. The wealthy investors praised her bravery on social media, and the business press painted her as a strong, loyal tech wife fiercely defending her corporate empire. But her glossy magazine article also served as a massive rallying battle cry for the greedy Preston family. They felt incredibly empowered by this highly supportive public narrative and decided it was the perfect time to put me in my place and force me to drop the lawsuit. That evening, my phone started ringing continuously on the kitchen counter. I looked at the bright screen and saw my mother-in-law's name flashing persistently. I did not decline the call or turn off my phone. I simply connected my device to my high-powered laptop, opened a professional audio recording software program, and pressed the big red record button. I answered the phone and put it on loudspeaker without saying a single word. My mother-in-law immediately started screaming so loudly that the audio levels on my computer screen instantly spiked into the red zone. She aggressively called me a jealous, miserable failure who simply could not stand to see her son succeed with a much younger and better woman. She praised Vanessa's magazine article, saying it was an absolute stroke of public relations brilliance, and that I was nothing but a pathetic gold digger trying to steal millions of dollars I never worked for. Before I could even take a breath, my sister-in-law Audrey snatched the phone away and started yelling directly into the receiver. Audrey told me that I was completely dead to their family and that I was a disgusting traitor. She threatened that if I did not immediately drop the civil lawsuit and issue a formal public apology to Vanessa, they would hire ruthless private investigators to dig up dirt on my family. She swore they would completely destroy my professional reputation as a forensic accountant, so I would never find a job in this state again. Then my father-in-law chimed in from the background. His voice was cold, calculating, and deeply threatening. He bragged that the billionaire investors were fully backing Ryan, and that my pathetic little lawsuit would be easily crushed by their army of elite corporate lawyers. He actually admitted on the recorded line that they all knew Vanessa was just playing a public relations role, but he justified it by saying the financial ends justified the deceptive means. They spent 20 agonizing minutes taking turns screaming at me, insulting my character, and actively confessing to their full knowledge of the massive corporate cover-up. They were so entirely blinded by their own greed and their arrogant hatred for me that they completely forgot they were actively participating in a massive criminal conspiracy over an open phone line. I sat comfortably in my ergonomic chair, silently watching the digital sound waves record every single vicious threat and every accidental legal confession. They were willingly handing me the exact verbal evidence I needed to prove their malicious intent in a federal courtroom. When they finally ran out of breath and angrily demanded that I answer them, I leaned forward toward the microphone. I softly and politely thanked them for their incredibly detailed feedback and told them to have a truly lovely evening. I hung up the phone and immediately backed up the high-quality audio file to my secure encrypted server. Vanessa thought her glossy magazine interview was a brilliant checkmate to save her public image and paint me as the villain. She had absolutely no idea she had just triggered the arrogant Preston family to hand me the final nail for their collective coffin. The pressure of the upcoming initial public offering was breathing heavily down everyone's necks. The Securities and Exchange Commission required a perfectly clean financial record before the company could legally go public. I knew Ryan was getting desperate to finalize the paperwork, and that desperation led to a massive explosive confrontation inside the corporate headquarters. Ryan called Jamal into his sprawling executive corner office. The heavy glass door shut quietly, but the tension in the room was absolutely deafening. Ryan pushed a thick stack of official corporate filings across his massive mahogany desk. It was the final quarterly financial report required by federal law before the public launch. Ryan handed Jamal an expensive gold pen and told him to sign his name on the chief financial officer's signature line. Jamal looked down at the official documents. The numbers printed on the pages were a complete work of pure fiction. The corporate revenue was artificially inflated by tens of millions of dollars, and the massive illegal wire transfers to Vanessa's offshore shell company were completely erased from the ledger. Jamal put the gold pen down on the desk. He looked his arrogant brother-in-law right in the eye and flatly refused to sign. Ryan let out a sharp, frustrated sigh, acting like Jamal was just a stubborn child, ruining a beautiful masterpiece. Ryan leaned over the desk, and his voice dropped into a dangerous, threatening whisper. He viciously reminded Jamal that he was the one who pulled him out of his mediocre middle-class life. Ryan claimed he personally gave Jamal the fancy corporate title, the luxury cars, and the elite social status that came with marrying into the wealthy Preston family. He explicitly ordered Jamal to stop acting like a paranoid coward, pick up the pen, and sign the federal documents immediately. But Jamal stood his ground with absolute integrity. He firmly told Ryan that he had worked his entire life to build a spotless professional reputation, and he was absolutely not going to commit federal wire fraud and perjure himself just to fund Ryan's illegal offshore accounts. Jamal turned his back on the furious chief executive officer and walked right out of the glass office, leaving the fraudulent papers completely unsigned on the desk. That evening, Jamal drove back to his massive suburban home, feeling the heavy, crushing weight of the corporate war on his shoulders. He walked into his pristine kitchen and found his wife Audrey pouring herself a large glass of expensive imported wine. Jamal desperately needed his wife to be his loyal partner in that dark moment. He needed her to understand the massive legal danger her corrupt brother was putting them in. He sat down at the kitchen island and told Audrey absolutely everything. He explained how Ryan was actively committing severe corporate fraud and how he was trying to force Jamal to sign the fake documents to take the ultimate legal fall if the federal investigators ever found out. Jamal fully expected Audrey to be completely horrified. He expected her to defend her husband and confront her criminal brother for putting their family at risk. But the toxic Preston family disease of absolute greed ran incredibly deep. Audrey did not gasp in shock or offer him a comforting embrace. Instead, she slammed her wine glass down on the marble counter so hard it almost shattered. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage and deep contempt. She looked at the man she had married and called him a pathetic, ungrateful coward. Audrey started screaming at him, echoing the exact same toxic manipulation her brother had used in the office. She yelled that Jamal was completely useless and that he was actively trying to sabotage her family's one ultimate chance at reaching billionaire status just because he was too weak to handle high-level corporate business. She aggressively demanded that he drive back to the headquarters, immediately apologize to Ryan, and sign whatever papers her brother put in front of him. Audrey began pacing around the kitchen, pointing her perfectly manicured finger directly at Jamal's chest. She viciously reminded him that the only reason he was even allowed to sit in that beautiful, expensive kitchen was because of her family's extreme generosity. She told him he owed his entire miserable existence to Ryan's brilliant tech vision. She explicitly stated that the initial public offering was going to secure their massive trust funds, and she absolutely refused to let his pathetic moral compass stand in the way of her luxury lifestyle. She ordered him to submit to her brother and do exactly as he was told, like a good, obedient employee. Jamal stood there silently listening to the cruel words of the woman he had loved and provided for over the last 4 years. The beautiful illusion of his marriage completely evaporated into thin air in a matter of seconds. He finally saw Audrey for exactly what she truly was. She was a greedy, entitled parasite who valued stolen corporate money far more than her own husband's freedom and soul. She was perfectly willing to let him go to a federal penitentiary for decades as long as she could keep shopping for designer handbags and attending elite billionaire galas. While Audrey continued to scream and throw vicious insults across the kitchen, Jamal did not argue back. He did not yell or try to reason with a woman who had completely lost her basic humanity to pure corporate greed. Jamal turned around and walked silently up the grand staircase. Audrey followed right behind him, still screaming at his back, demanding that he answer her. Jamal walked straight into his private home office and locked the heavy wooden door, leaving her violently pounding her fists against the wood from the hallway. He sat down at his secure computer terminal and quickly bypassed the internal corporate firewall. He accessed the highly restricted executive email server and meticulously downloaded the final crucial pieces of digital evidence. He exported the specific email threads where Ryan explicitly commanded him to alter the revenue numbers and hide the offshore transfers. It was the absolute, undeniable smoking gun that proved Ryan was the sole mastermind behind the entire financial conspiracy. Jamal saved the encrypted files onto a portable flash drive and slipped it securely into his jacket pocket. He then walked into his massive walk-in closet and pulled down a large travel duffel bag. He methodically packed his simple clothes, his essential personal documents, and his own items. He purposely did not pack a single thing that the Preston family had bought for him. He only took the things he had earned with his own hard work. He threw his bag over his shoulder and unlocked the office door. Audrey was still standing there, her face red with anger, waiting to continue her toxic rant. Jamal looked at her with a chilling, absolute emptiness. He did not see his loving wife anymore. He only saw another criminal conspirator standing in his way. He calmly walked right past her, completely ignoring her loud, selfish demands. Audrey suddenly realized what was happening and started panicking, asking him where he thought he was going. Jamal stopped at the heavy front door and looked back at her one last time. He spoke in a very quiet, incredibly firm voice. He told her that he was completely done being the disposable scapegoat for a family of arrogant criminals. He advised her to contact her high-priced divorce lawyers in the morning because he was never coming back to this toxic house ever again. He walked out into the cool night air, started his car, and drove away into the darkness. He was no longer just the silent chief financial officer. He was now the most dangerous weapon I had in my entire arsenal. And together we were finally ready to burn the Preston Empire straight to the ground. The civil lawsuit and the sudden emergency injunction had cast a massive dark shadow over the entire executive board. I knew it was only a matter of time before Ryan realized that his aggressive intimidation tactics were completely failing. He was a man who was utterly obsessed with his public image and the total control of his environment. When he finally understood that he could not starve me out financially or humiliate me into submission, he decided to deploy his absolute, final, and most devastating psychological weapon. He managed to track down my new location and decided to ambush me in person. It was late in the afternoon and I was sitting in the quiet, sophisticated lounge of a high-end hotel in the downtown financial district. I was drinking a cup of green tea and reviewing the digital files Jamal had given me. The atmosphere was incredibly peaceful until the heavy glass doors of the lounge swung open and Ryan walked in. He was wearing his signature expensive tailored suit, but the flawless, confident illusion he usually projected was beginning to show severe cracks. His posture was rigid, his jaw was tightly clenched, and there were dark, exhausted circles under his eyes. The immense stress of the frozen corporate assets and the looming federal implications were clearly eating him alive from the inside out. He spotted me sitting in the corner booth and marched directly toward my table. He did not bother to ask for permission to join me. He aggressively pulled out the heavy leather chair opposite mine and sat down heavily. He tried to force his classic charming and condescending smile, but his eyes were completely cold and frantic like a trapped predator. He leaned across the small table and started speaking in a low, highly controlled voice. He told me that my little legal stunt with the civil lawsuit was very cute and highly dramatic, but it was finally time to end this childish temper tantrum. He claimed that the board of directors was getting slightly annoyed by the ridiculous media rumors, and he wanted to wrap this entire mess up before the massive initial public offering next week. I did not say a single word. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my green tea and looked at him with an absolutely blank expression. I let the heavy, uncomfortable silence stretch between us, knowing that when a narcissist does not get the emotional reaction they desperately crave, they tend to rapidly escalate their toxic behavior. Ryan shifted in his chair and dropped the fake polite act completely. His handsome face twisted into an ugly mask of pure malice. His voice dropped into a venomous, threatening hiss. He told me that if I did not call my legal team and completely drop the civil lawsuit by the end of the business day, he was going to unleash absolute hell on my life. He decided to target the one thing he knew I valued above almost anything else: my professional pride and my career as a forensic accountant. Ryan went into granular, terrifying detail about his final threat. He told me that his corporate legal team was a massive army of ruthless sharks who specialized in total character assassination. He threatened to file a barrage of massive countersuits against me personally. He looked me dead in the eye and said his lawyers would fabricate complex financial evidence, claiming that I was the one who mismanaged and embezzled the company funds during the early volatile startup years. He said they would officially report me to the National Accounting Board and petition to have my professional license permanently revoked for gross ethical violations. Ryan smiled a cruel, wicked smile, thoroughly enjoying the terrifying picture he was painting of my future. He leaned closer and told me that in the ruthless corporate world of Silicon Valley, perception is reality. He said that even if I was completely innocent, the sheer overwhelming volume of negative press, aggressive legal accusations, and corporate smear campaigns would completely and permanently destroy my professional reputation. He promised me with absolute certainty that no respected financial institution, no accounting firm, and no corporate client would ever hire me again. He swore that I would be absolutely blacklisted across the entire country, entirely bankrupt from defending myself against his endless legal fees, and completely disgraced in the eyes of my peers. He reached inside his expensive suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He threw it onto the glass table between us with a loud, authoritative smack. He said it was a full official withdrawal of the civil lawsuit combined with an incredibly strict, ironclad non-disclosure agreement. He commanded me to pick up a pen and sign the document immediately. He told me this was his absolute final warning and my very last chance to walk away with a pathetic little alimony check before his elite lawyers tore my entire existence down to the ground. He leaned back into his heavy leather chair, crossed his legs, and waited for me to panic. He fully expected me to shake with absolute terror. He expected me to realize the massive, crushing power imbalance between a billionaire tech chief executive officer and a single suburban housewife. He wanted me to finally submit to his supreme authority and sign my rights away in tears. But he had absolutely no idea who he was actually sitting across from. I was not just a disgruntled ex-wife fighting for scraps. I was the legal owner of the shadow venture capital firm that held his entire corporate debt. I had his chief financial officer ready to testify against him in federal court, and I possessed the encrypted hard drive containing every single piece of evidence proving his massive wire fraud. I looked down at the thick legal document sitting on the glass table, and I did not even flinch. I did not reach for it, and I did not try to defend my career or argue with his pathetic threats. I slowly looked up from the table and locked my eyes directly onto Ryan's. The utter lack of fear and the chilling absolute calm on my face made his confident, arrogant smirk slowly fade away into deep, unsettling confusion. I slowly raised my left wrist and looked down at my watch. I stared at the ticking second hand for a long, deliberate moment, letting the heavy, suffocating silence completely crush his remaining false confidence. Then I looked directly back into his panicked eyes. I told him in a perfectly calm and steady voice that he had exactly 24 hours left as the chief executive officer. I told him to enjoy every single second of it. Before Ryan could even process the massive crushing weight of my words, I smoothly stood up from the booth, grabbed my leather purse, and walked away. I did not look back a single time. I walked out of the sophisticated lounge and stepped into the bright afternoon sun, leaving him sitting completely alone at the table, staring blankly at the unsigned paper. His final pathetic psychological game was completely over, and the real ultimate execution was finally about to begin. The evening of the pre-initial public offering gala finally arrived. The massive grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel was completely transformed into a spectacular display of corporate wealth and absolute arrogance. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over hundreds of wealthy venture capitalists, powerful Wall Street bankers, and top-tier technology journalists. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos navigated smoothly through the crowded room, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with $1,000 champagne and expensive imported caviar. At the very center of this opulent room stood Ryan and his entire fake corporate family, soaking in the flashing lights of the press cameras. Vanessa was playing her fraudulent role to absolute perfection. She was wearing a breathtaking custom-designed emerald green evening gown that clung perfectly to her figure with brilliant diamonds glittering at her throat and wrists. She stood right by Ryan's side, holding his arm and smiling radiantly for the photographers. I could hear her polished voice echoing over the ambient noise of the ballroom as she confidently introduced herself to a group of major institutional investors as Mrs. Preston, the proud wife and chief operating officer. She spoke with such practiced elegance, spinning her fabricated stories about their late-night coding sessions and their beautiful shared vision for the future of the company. Ryan stood there nodding along his chest, puffed out with supreme narcissistic pride, believing he had successfully pulled off the greatest financial deception in Silicon Valley history. They thought they had already won the war. They thought I was sitting alone in my quiet apartment, completely defeated by his ruthless legal threats and his financial abuse. Ryan genuinely believed his final psychological attack had completely broken my spirit and forced me into silent submission. But they were about to experience a very rude and highly public awakening. Exactly 1 hour into the glamorous event, just as the crucial keynote speeches were about to begin, the massive heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung wide open. I did not sneak in through the back catering entrance or try to blend quietly into the background shadows. I walked straight through the main entrance, stepping right onto the edge of the plush red carpet. I was no longer wearing my comfortable suburban clothes or carrying myself like a quiet, invisible housewife. I was wearing a stunning floor-length crimson-red designer gown that commanded absolute immediate attention. My hair and makeup were flawlessly styled, projecting the aura of a woman who held absolute power and unshakable confidence. But the most intimidating part of my grand entrance was not my beautiful dress. It was the man walking right beside me. I was accompanied by one of the most feared and highly respected corporate litigation attorneys in the entire country. He was a tall, imposing man, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, carrying a thick leather briefcase that literally held the legal destruction of Ryan's entire fake empire. He walked beside me with the cold, calculated confidence of a massive legal shark who was about to smell fresh blood in the water. As we stepped confidently into the ballroom, the dynamic of the entire room shifted almost instantly. A few veteran tech journalists who recognized me from the early startup days lowered their expensive cameras and started whispering frantically to each other. Those hushed whispers spread rapidly through the elite crowd like a massive wave of electricity. Heads began to turn one by one until a very large portion of the room was staring directly at us. The soft, classical music playing quietly in the background seemed to completely fade away as the ambient chatter died down into an uncomfortable silence. Vanessa was in the middle of laughing loudly at a terrible joke made by a wealthy banker when she finally noticed the sudden drastic shift in the room. She turned her head, followed the collective gaze of the crowd, and locked eyes directly with me. Her fake, radiant smile completely vanished in a millisecond. The warm color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking absolutely pale and terrified. She instinctively took a sudden step back, bumping right into Ryan. Ryan turned around annoyed to see what had frightened his fake wife, and the exact moment he saw me standing there looking like absolute corporate royalty, his handsome face contorted into an ugly mask of pure rage and sheer panic. All of his elegant billionaire charm instantly evaporated. He realized immediately that I had not been intimidated by his terrible threats, and that my powerful presence here alongside a high-powered attorney was a massive catastrophic threat to his multi-million-dollar public offering. He did not politely walk over to ask me to leave. His massive, fragile ego and his sudden blinding desperation took complete control of his actions. Ryan immediately raised his hand and frantically signaled for the private security team stationed around the perimeter of the ballroom. Two very large muscular men in dark suits immediately began pushing their way through the dense crowd of wealthy investors heading straight toward me. Ryan did not care about keeping his voice down or maintaining his professional image anymore. He aggressively pointed his finger right at me and loudly ordered the security guards to remove me from the premises immediately. He shouted across the quiet room, claiming that I was an uninvited, mentally unstable former associate who was just trying to cause a desperate scene and extort the company. His voice actually cracked with panic, echoing loudly through the silent, elegant ballroom. Every single journalist, venture capitalist, and board member in that massive room stopped exactly what they were doing and turned to watch the dramatic confrontation unfold. The flashing press cameras instantly pivoted away from the main stage and aimed directly at us, capturing every single embarrassing second of Ryan's massive public meltdown. The two large security guards quickly approached me, and my intimidating attorney holding their heavy hands out to block our path forward. They sternly told us that we were trespassing on a highly private corporate event and that we needed to turn around and leave the building immediately, or they would forcefully remove us in front of the press. I did not step back. I did not show a single ounce of fear, panic, or embarrassment. I stood perfectly still, completely unfazed by the aggressive guards towering over me. I simply smiled a very cold, victorious smile right at Ryan while the entire room watched in absolute stunned silence, waiting desperately to see what would happen next. The two massive security guards stood directly in front of me, physically blocking my path to the center of the luxurious ballroom. Ryan was still shouting from across the room, frantically ordering them to throw me out into the street like a common criminal. But before the heavy hands of the guards could even touch the fabric of my crimson designer gown, my attorney smoothly stepped forward. He did not raise his voice or cause an embarrassing physical altercation. He simply opened his premium leather briefcase, pulled out a thick, legally binding document bearing the official heavy seal of the state Supreme Court, and held it directly in front of the head of security. He calmly informed the guards in a low, highly authoritative tone that I was a legally recognized financial stakeholder actively involved in an ongoing corporate litigation. He explicitly warned them that physically removing me from a shareholder event would result in an immediate multi-million-dollar federal lawsuit against the hotel management and their private security firm. The head guard read the bold black print on the court injunction. His tough face instantly turned pale, and he immediately signaled his men to stand down and step aside. I did not even spare a single glance at Ryan or Vanessa, who were standing completely frozen near the main stage. I completely ignored his pathetic, angry shouting. Instead, I walked straight past them, my high heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor, heading directly toward the most important table in the entire grand ballroom. It was the heavily guarded exclusive section where the executive board of directors and the lead venture capitalists from New York were sitting. These were the incredibly wealthy men who were preparing to pump hundreds of millions of dollars into Ryan's fraudulent public offering tomorrow morning. As I approached their velvet rope table, the older billionaires in their bespoke tailored suits stopped drinking their expensive champagne and stared at me with intense curiosity and deep confusion. They had just watched me effortlessly bypass the elite corporate security team with a single piece of paper, and they instantly knew I was not just some crazy, disgruntled ex-wife trying to cause a senseless, dramatic scene. I stopped right at the head of their long table, resting my hands gracefully on the back of an empty velvet chair. I looked directly into the eyes of the lead investor, a ruthless Wall Street veteran who controlled the vast majority of the upcoming public shares. I introduced myself clearly and confidently, not as Ryan's wife, but as a licensed forensic accountant with over a decade of high-level corporate experience. I told them I was standing there tonight to perform my absolute fiduciary duty and save them from making the most catastrophic financial mistake of their entire professional careers. The lead investor frowned deeply, setting his crystal glass down, and asked me exactly what I meant by that bold statement. I did not sugarcoat a single word, and I did not lower my voice. I projected my words just enough so the surrounding tables and the closest tech journalists could hear every single devastating syllable clearly. I formally declared that the beautiful, flawless financial prospectus they had been reading all night was a complete work of absolute fiction. I told them that OmniStream Technology was secretly carrying a massive undisclosed venture capital loan of exactly $50 million that had been intentionally and illegally hidden from all the public ledgers and audit reports. And more importantly, I calmly announced that the charismatic chief executive officer they were about to trust with their billions of dollars was currently the primary target of an active federal investigation for massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and illegal offshore asset concealment. The absolute silence that followed my declaration was incredibly heavy and entirely suffocating. The entire board of directors erupted into chaotic, panicked whispers. The lead investor turned completely white, looking back and forth between me and the financial documents sitting on his table. Right at that exact moment, Ryan finally reached our table, sprinting across the ballroom, sweating profusely and completely out of breath. He aggressively pushed his way past my attorney, trying to physically block me from the view of the board of directors. Ryan let out a loud, exaggerated laugh that sounded incredibly forced and entirely unhinged. He threw his hands up in the air and flashed his signature charming smile, but his eyes were wide with sheer absolute panic. He told the billionaire investors to please forgive the interruption, and boldly asked them to ignore the hysterical rantings of a bitter, jealous woman who was simply going through a severe mental breakdown over their impending divorce. Ryan leaned heavily over the table and confidently assured the board that there was absolutely nothing to worry about and that the company finances were perfectly spotless. He decided to play a dangerous game of half-truths to save his collapsing image. He admitted to the investors that yes, there was a $50 million seed loan from 5 years ago during the early startup days, but he arrogantly dismissed it as a completely standard, harmless debt. He laughed loudly, waving his hand dismissively, and told the board that the loan was from some anonymous toothless shell fund called Apex Ventures. He confidently claimed that Apex Ventures was a silent, passive entity managed by cowards who had absolutely zero voting power and zero legal ability to interfere with the massive initial public offering. He looked at me with pure venom in his eyes and called me a desperate, pathetic liar for fabricating ridiculous stories about federal criminal charges just to get attention and ruin his special night. Ryan stood tall, adjusting his expensive suit jacket, genuinely believing that his charismatic damage control had successfully manipulated the wealthy investors and saved his fragile corporate empire. He thought he had completely neutralized my threat by casually dismissing the massive debt and painting me as a crazy, hysterical woman. He had absolutely no idea that by publicly admitting the existence of the Apex Ventures loan and arrogantly mocking the power of that specific investment fund, he had just walked blindly and willingly into my final deadly execution trap. I did not argue with him or try to shout over his loud, arrogant lies. I just stood there looking at him with a chilling, victorious smile, waiting for the final piece of my ultimate destruction plan to walk right onto the ballroom floor. Ryan was still standing there with that sickening, arrogant smile on his face. He truly believed he had successfully talked his way out of a massive federal crime. The billionaire investors at the VIP table looked slightly uncertain, but they were slowly nodding along to his charismatic lies. They desperately wanted to believe his smooth excuses because billions of dollars were on the line tomorrow morning. Ryan turned to the heavy security guards and confidently ordered them to escort me out of the building. But before anyone could take a single step forward, a loud and incredibly clear voice echoed through the massive grand ballroom. It was a voice that commanded absolute financial authority and deep respect. The crowded room parted like the Red Sea. Walking straight down the center of the plush red carpet was Jamal, the chief financial officer of the corporation. Jamal did not look like the quiet, submissive brother-in-law the greedy Preston family had abused and manipulated for years. He walked with the heavy, confident stride of a man who had completely freed himself from a toxic, suffocating prison. He was wearing a sharp, tailored dark suit and holding a small metallic object tightly in his right hand. Audrey, my horrible sister-in-law, was standing near the front row of the audience. When she saw her husband walking purposefully toward the executive table, her face turned bright red with pure anger. She aggressively stepped right into his path and loudly ordered him to stop embarrassing her family. She demanded that he get back in line and support her brother like a good, obedient employee. Jamal did not even slow down his stride. He looked at Audrey with absolute freezing disgust and walked right past her as if she did not even exist. The sheer dismissal in his cold eyes made Audrey freeze in total, absolute shock. Jamal walked straight past Ryan and completely ignored Vanessa's terrified, trembling expression. He stepped right up to the velvet-roped VIP table and stood directly next to my attorney and me. He looked directly at the lead Wall Street investor and the rest of the wealthy executive board. He introduced himself, clearly stating his full legal name and his official corporate title as the Chief Financial Officer. The entire grand ballroom went completely dead silent once again. A chief financial officer publicly interrupting a major pre-initial public offering gala was completely unprecedented in the tech industry. Ryan started panicking wildly, realizing that his ultimate scapegoat had just gone rogue. He rushed forward and grabbed Jamal's arm violently, hissing at him to shut his mouth and remember exactly who paid his massive salary. Jamal calmly looked down at Ryan's shaking hand and told him to let go before he added physical assault to his rapidly growing list of federal criminal charges. Ryan instantly pulled his hand back as if he had been burned by actual fire. Jamal turned his attention back to the billionaire investors and the massive silent crowd of tech journalists. He spoke loudly and clearly, ensuring every single person in the massive room could hear the absolute devastating truth. He stated that he was standing there under his own free will to officially corroborate every single word I had just spoken. He formally declared that the highly anticipated public offering was built on a massive, rotting foundation of systemic corporate fraud. He explained in painful, granular detail how Ryan had been intentionally inflating the company revenue by tens of millions of dollars, using completely fabricated vendor contracts and fake advanced payments. He then ruthlessly exposed the darkest secret of them all. He told the horrified investors about the offshore shell company registered in Delaware called Horizon Ventures. He explicitly stated that Vanessa, the fake tech wife and chief operating officer, was the sole legal owner of that hidden shell company. He confirmed that she and Ryan had been actively embezzling company funds to hide liquid assets offshore before a planned, sudden divorce. The wealthy investors started gasping in absolute horror and pure outrage. Ryan was shaking violently, waving his hands and shouting that Jamal was just a disgruntled, unstable employee trying to ruin the company out of pure jealousy. But Jamal was fully prepared for Ryan's pathetic, desperate denial. Jamal looked across the long VIP table and locked eyes with a tall, older man sitting quietly at the very end. It was the senior partner from the independent auditing firm hired directly by the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission to legally oversee the public offering. Jamal walked over to the senior independent auditor and held out his right hand. He placed a military-grade encrypted flash drive directly onto the crisp white tablecloth. He announced perfectly clearly that the drive contained the unaltered original financial ledgers, every single illegal wire transfer receipt, and the direct internal email chains where Ryan explicitly ordered him to commit federal wire fraud. Jamal looked the independent auditor dead in the eye and formally surrendered the hard evidence. He stated that he was fully cooperating with federal law enforcement authorities and had already submitted duplicate copies of that exact drive to the Securities and Exchange Commission earlier that very afternoon. The exact moment those devastating words left Jamal's mouth, the entire sophisticated atmosphere in the grand ballroom completely shattered into absolute, uncontrolled chaos. The lead venture capitalist slammed his heavy fists on the table and started screaming at Ryan, demanding his $50 million back immediately. The tech journalists rushed forward toward the stage like a pack of starving wolves. Their bright camera flashes exploded like rapid strobe lights, capturing the exact historic moment the golden tech empire brutally collapsed. I stood completely still and looked over at the toxic Preston family. Ryan looked like a dead walking ghost. His arrogant, charismatic face was completely drained of all human color, and he was physically shaking uncontrollably. He stumbled backward away from the screaming investors, bumping into a terrified waiter and knocking a massive silver tray of expensive champagne glasses onto the hard marble floor. The loud, shattering crash echoed sharply through the screaming, panicked crowd. Vanessa was hyperventilating wildly, holding onto the edge of the wooden stage just so she would not collapse to the floor. Her fake glamorous billionaire lifestyle was literally evaporating right before her terrified eyes. My father-in-law was clutching his chest in pure panic, and Audrey was crying hysterically, finally realizing she had just permanently lost her loyal husband and her massive trust fund in the exact same spectacular night. The steel trap had been perfectly executed. The financial evidence was absolutely undeniable. I just stood there next to Jamal, watching the glorious, absolute destruction of the arrogant people who actually thought they could bury me alive. The grand ballroom was entirely consumed by absolute screaming chaos. The billionaire venture capitalists were furiously yelling at Ryan, demanding their massive investments back. The independent auditor was carefully securing Jamal's encrypted flash drive, knowing it held the absolute destruction of the entire executive board. Ryan was desperately trying to shout over the deafening noise of the panicked crowd. His perfectly styled hair was completely ruined, and sweat was pouring down his pale face. He grabbed a microphone from the stage and frantically begged the wealthy investors to calm down. He screamed that Jamal was lying and that even if there were minor accounting errors, the company was still fundamentally strong. He aggressively pointed his shaking finger at me and yelled that my earlier mention of the $50 million loan from Apex Ventures meant absolutely nothing. He arrogantly shouted to the room that Apex Ventures was just a faceless, passive shell fund that had absolutely zero voting rights and zero power to stop the initial public offering. He thought he could still salvage his fake billionaire status by completely dismissing the anonymous debt. I stood completely calm in the center of the storm, listening to his pathetic, desperate lies. I waited until his frantic shouting echoed into a brief momentary silence in the massive room. Then I slowly walked directly up to the head of the velvet-roped executive table. I opened my designer clutch and pulled out a thick stack of highly classified legal documents printed on heavy premium paper. I did not throw them aggressively. I placed them very gently and deliberately, right in the center of the polished table, directly in front of the lead Wall Street investor and the independent federal auditor. I looked at Ryan, who was staring at me with wild, terrified eyes, and I finally delivered the absolute greatest plot twist of his entire pathetic life. I spoke in a voice so incredibly clear and cold that it cut through the remaining ambient noise like a sharpened steel blade. I told Ryan that he was entirely correct about the $50 million seed funding coming from a private shadow fund called Apex Ventures 5 years ago, when he was completely broke and desperate. But I told him he was absolutely dead wrong about them being a faceless, powerless entity. I advised the lead investor to turn to the third page of the verified legal incorporation document sitting on the table. The older billionaire quickly flipped the heavy pages and scanned the legal text. His eyes widened in absolute massive shock as he read the name of the sole legal proprietor out loud for the entire ballroom to hear. The name printed in bold black ink as the absolute single owner of the Apex Ventures $50 million mega fund was Naomi Preston. The collective gasp that sucked the air out of the grand ballroom was absolutely legendary. Ryan physically stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the stage just to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. His arrogant jaw completely dropped open, and his eyes bulged out of his head as if he were looking at an actual ghost. Vanessa let out a strange, high-pitched whimper and covered her mouth with her trembling hands. I looked directly into Ryan's horrified face and explained the absolute brutal truth he had been too blind to see for 7 entire years. I told him that when we first got married, my wealthy grandfather passed away and left me a massive secret inheritance. I deliberately chose never to tell him about the money because I knew his massive, fragile ego could never handle being funded by his own quiet suburban wife. When his early tech startup was completely failing and facing total absolute bankruptcy 5 years ago, I secretly created the Apex Ventures firm. I used my own personal family inheritance to blindly inject $50 million into his failing company to save his precious dream. I was the anonymous angel investor who built his entire fake empire from the completely invisible shadows. He had spent the last 5 years living off my money, sleeping in a house bought by my money, and using my money to fund his fake billionaire lifestyle with his fake corporate wife. Ryan started violently shaking his head back and forth, desperately denying the reality unfolding right in front of him. He stuttered and stammered, claiming that even if I was the secret owner of the debt, it was just a standard startup loan and he would easily pay me back after the company went public tomorrow. He arrogantly tried to convince the panicked room that my ownership of the debt changed absolutely nothing about his position as the supreme chief executive officer. That was exactly when my elite corporate attorney stepped forward and delivered the final, absolute, fatal legal blow. My lawyer projected his booming voice across the silent ballroom, explaining standard United States corporate finance law. He stated that the original $50 million loan contract contained a very strict standard legal clause known as a debt covenant. He explained that under the explicit terms of this specific debt covenant, if the borrowing entity committed any form of severe financial fraud, federal embezzlement, or material misrepresentation, the massive loan would immediately default. And the legally binding penalty for a catastrophic default was not just a simple cash repayment. I stepped forward and finished the legal explanation myself, looking Ryan dead in his terrified eyes. I told him that because he and Vanessa had actively committed massive federal wire fraud and embezzled company funds to their offshore shell company, they had officially triggered the absolute breach of the debt covenant. According to the flawless legal contract he blindly signed 5 years ago, Apex Ventures had the immediate unilateral right to convert the defaulted debt into direct corporate equity. I smiled a chilling, beautiful smile and announced the exact mathematical conversion rate. The penalty gave my shadow firm the immediate legal right to seize exactly 80% of the total corporate shares of OmniStream Technology. The lead investor quickly reviewed the documents and loudly confirmed to the entire room that the legal paperwork was absolutely ironclad and perfectly executed. There was no trial needed and no lengthy corporate negotiation required. It was an immediate hostile corporate takeover triggered by his own arrogant criminal greed. Ryan was officially stripped of all his voting power and all of his executive control in a single devastating second. I looked at the man who had tried to throw me out of my own home and freeze my health insurance. I told him very quietly, but clearly, that he did not own the technology. He did not own the massive building we were standing in, and he certainly did not own the company anymore. I told him that I was now the official absolute majority owner of OmniStream, and his fake corporate stage play was permanently over. My mother-in-law, who was standing near the front of the stage, let out a loud, agonizing wail and actually collapsed into a nearby chair. She finally realized that the quiet daughter-in-law she had viciously mocked and forced to sit in the dark corner by the kitchen doors was actually the sole billionaire funder of their entire arrogant family. My father-in-law looked like he was having a genuine medical emergency, clutching his chest as he watched his promised vacation estates and massive trust funds completely evaporate into thin air. Audrey was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, realizing she had thrown away a loyal, honest husband for a brother who did not even own the company he was bragging about. Ryan fell to his knees right there on the plush red carpet. The massive crushing weight of his absolute failure finally broke his legs. He was staring blankly at the polished marble floor, completely unable to process the magnitude of his destruction. He had spent months carefully plotting to leave me with absolutely nothing, using his fake corporate wife to secure his greedy future. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a naive suburban housewife. He never realized until this exact horrifying moment that I was the one who actually owned the entire board and all the pieces on it. The federal independent auditor immediately pulled out his phone to call the authorities to secure the building and lock down the executive offices. I stood tall in my crimson gown, surrounded by the flashing cameras of the tech journalists holding absolute supreme power over the very empire that tried to bury me. I did not just stand there letting the shock wear off. I walked past the frozen bodies of the billionaire investors and stepped right up onto the main stage. The microphone that Ryan had just dropped in his sheer panic was lying on the plush velvet carpet. I bent down, picked it up, and tapped the top of it twice. The sharp thumping sound snapped everyone in the massive room back to reality. The entire grand ballroom fell into a terrifying, deathly silence. Every single camera lens, every single journalist, and every single wealthy investor was hanging on to my every movement. I looked down at Ryan, who was still kneeling on the floor, his expensive custom suit completely wrinkled and his face buried deep in his trembling hands. I looked over at Vanessa, who was gripping the edge of the wooden stage, her knuckles completely white, her breathing erratic and incredibly shallow. She looked exactly like a cornered rat trapped under a blinding spotlight. I held the microphone close and projected my voice with the absolute calm authority of a true corporate owner. I stated clearly that as the legally verified holder of 80% of the corporate equity, I was immediately exercising my absolute executive right to restructure the leadership of this company. I turned my body and looked directly at the woman who had shamelessly stolen my name and paraded around the elite business world as my husband's fake wife. I told Vanessa Montgomery that her role as the chief operating officer was officially terminated, effective immediately. I stated for the entire room to hear that she was being fired for gross corporate misconduct, illegal asset concealment, and federal wire fraud. Vanessa let out a pathetic, choked sob, her knees buckling completely as she slid down the side of the stage, collapsing into a pathetic heap of designer silk and stolen diamonds. She tried to hide her face from the flashing cameras, but it was far too late. Then I turned my eyes to the man I had spent 7 long years loving, protecting, and supporting. Ryan slowly lifted his head from his hands and looked up at me with eyes full of absolute terror and sudden pathetic pleading. He opened his mouth, probably to beg to whisper some pathetic manipulation about how we could fix this entire mess together, but I did not give him the chance to speak a single deceptive word. I told Ryan Preston, the former chief executive officer, that he was also terminated immediately for orchestrating a massive criminal conspiracy against his own loyal investors and his own family. I told him he had zero power, zero executive authority, and absolutely zero access to any corporate funds or properties, starting from this exact second. Ryan suddenly snapped. The total catastrophic destruction of his massive fragile ego pushed him into pure blind animalistic panic. He scrambled to his feet, his face flushed a deep shade of purple with pure desperate rage. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding that the private security guards do their jobs. He aggressively pointed his shaking finger right at me and ordered them to grab me and drag me off his stage. But the power dynamic of the room had completely shifted, and harsh reality had finally caught up with his arrogant delusions. The head of the private security team, a large, intimidating man who had tried to block my path just 20 minutes ago, looked at Ryan and then slowly looked up at me. He had just heard the top corporate lawyers and the Wall Street investors verify my absolute legal ownership. He knew exactly who was going to sign his massive security contract tomorrow morning, and it was certainly not the sweating, desperate man screaming on the floor. The head security guard did not take a single step toward me. Instead, he gave a sharp, firm nod to his massive men. Two heavy security guards stepped right past my podium, walked directly over to Ryan, and grabbed him violently by both of his arms. Ryan started thrashing and screaming wildly, demanding that they let him go, claiming he was still their boss and threatening to sue them all. The head guard stepped forward, looked him dead in the eye, and stated in a cold, flat voice that they only took orders from the actual owner of the building. Another guard walked over and firmly grabbed Vanessa's arm, lifting her off the floor while she cried hysterically, completely ruining her expensive professional makeup. The poetic justice of the exact guards Ryan had hired to humiliate me and throw me out, now forcibly restraining him, was absolutely beautiful to watch. But the absolute ultimate finale was still waiting just outside the ballroom doors. Just as Ryan was violently struggling against the heavy grip of the security guards, the heavy mahogany doors at the very back of the room violently burst open. A massive team of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the large yellow letters of the Securities and Exchange Commission printed across their backs marched aggressively into the grand ballroom. They were accompanied by armed federal marshals carrying thick stacks of official arrest warrants. Jamal had done his job perfectly. The encrypted flash drive he handed over earlier that afternoon, combined with my civil lawsuit, had triggered an immediate emergency federal raid. The federal agents parted the massive crowd of stunned billionaires and walked straight up to the front of the stage. The lead agent pulled out a pair of heavy, solid steel handcuffs. He looked directly at Ryan and Vanessa and loudly declared that they were officially under arrest for multiple felony counts of federal wire fraud, securities manipulation, and massive corporate embezzlement. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around Ryan's wrists echoed through the silent room like the final tolling of a heavy funeral bell. Vanessa instantly started screaming, pleading with the federal agents, swearing that Ryan had forced her to do it, throwing her fake corporate husband under the bus without a single second of hesitation to save her own skin. The media frenzy instantly exploded into absolute madness. The tech journalists shoved their way to the absolute front, flashing their bright cameras mere inches away from Ryan's utterly humiliated face. The entire toxic Preston family was caught right in the brutal crossfire of the media assault. My mother-in-law was hiding her face behind her expensive designer purse, sobbing loudly as the high-definition cameras captured her complete and utter social disgrace. My father-in-law stood completely frozen, looking like a totally broken, empty man as he watched his golden child being dragged away by federal marshals in front of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley. Audrey was crying hysterically, sitting completely alone on a banquet chair, entirely abandoned by the husband she had treated like garbage. Their entire fake legacy of wealth and superiority was brutally crushed into fine dust right in front of the flashing lenses of the national media. I stood perfectly still on the elevated stage watching the federal agents march my ex-husband out of the ballroom in heavy steel chains. The execution was completely flawless, and my new empire was finally swept entirely clean. The sharp metallic sound of the heavy federal handcuffs locking tightly around their wrists echoed through the chaotic ballroom. The absolute reality of federal prisons suddenly crashed down upon Vanessa, the glamorous fake wife who had spent months parading around in stolen diamonds and designer gowns, completely shattered under the blinding lights of the press cameras. The second the federal agent secured the steel chains around her delicate wrists, her entire loyal facade instantly evaporated. She did not look at Ryan with love or solidarity. She turned into a desperate, terrified animal willing to chew off her own limb to escape the trap. Vanessa started screaming at the top of her lungs, completely ignoring the flashing cameras. She looked directly at the lead federal investigator and frantically began shifting every single ounce of the blame onto the man standing right next to her. She yelled that Ryan was a manipulative psychopath who had forced her into the entire scheme. She cried hysterically, claiming she was just an innocent, naive employee who was threatened into signing the offshore bank documents. She screamed that Ryan had promised to ruin her life if she did not pretend to be his wife and help him steal the investor funds. She begged the federal agents for total immunity, offering to testify against him in federal court and promising to hand over every single piece of private communication they had ever shared. Ryan stood there frozen in his heavy steel handcuffs, staring at Vanessa in absolute horrified disbelief. The beautiful, brilliant partner he had chosen over his own loyal wife was now publicly butchering him in front of the entire Silicon Valley elite to save her own skin. He opened his mouth to argue back, to call her a disgusting liar, but the federal marshals aggressively pushed him forward, silencing his pathetic protests. The media captured every single humiliating second of the golden tech couple tearing each other apart like starving wolves. But the pathetic display of ultimate betrayal was not just limited to the two criminals in handcuffs. The absolute destruction of the Preston family empire was rippling through the massive room, hitting my former in-laws with massive, devastating force. My father-in-law, the arrogant man who had proudly threatened to crush me with his elite lawyers just a few days ago, was now physically trembling. My mother-in-law, the cruel woman who had forced me to sit in a dark corner near the kitchen doors, suddenly broke through the dense crowd of stunned investors. She was followed closely by my vicious sister-in-law, Audrey. The three of them rushed directly toward the elevated stage where I was standing. All of their supreme aristocratic arrogance was completely gone, replaced by sheer pathetic desperation. They looked at the federal agents dragging Ryan toward the exit, and then they looked up at me. My mother-in-law actually fell to her knees at the bottom of the wooden stairs. Tears were streaming down her heavily made-up face, ruining her expensive cosmetics. She held her shaking hands up toward me and started begging loudly. She pleaded with me to call off the federal agents and tell the independent auditors it was all just a massive family misunderstanding. She cried out my name, calling me her sweet, beautiful daughter, and begging me to remember the 7 years we spent together as a happy family. She promised that if I just dropped the federal charges, they would give me anything I wanted and treat me like absolute royalty for the rest of my life. My father-in-law was crying silently, nodding along with his wife, desperately hoping I would show them the mercy they had violently denied me. When they realized I was standing there looking at them with a completely blank expression, they turned their frantic attention to the man standing right beside me. Audrey rushed toward Jamal, the husband she had verbally abused and abandoned for being too honest. She reached out and grabbed his tailored suit jacket, sobbing uncontrollably. Audrey begged Jamal to talk some sense into me. She pleaded with him to use his influence as my ally to save her brother from spending decades in a federal penitentiary. She cried out that she loved him and that they could go back to their massive suburban home and fix their broken marriage if he just helped her family survive this terrible nightmare. Jamal looked down at the woman gripping his jacket. His eyes held absolutely no anger and no sadness. There was only a cold, deep emptiness. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He did not say a single comforting word to her. He simply pulled her desperate hands off his jacket and pressed the heavy document firmly against her chest. Audrey looked down at the papers and let out a loud, agonizing gasp. It was a fully finalized divorce petition, citing irreconcilable differences and absolute financial separation. Jamal looked at his hysterical wife and told her in a perfectly calm, quiet voice that she was officially holding the only piece of paper he would ever give her family again. He told her to contact his attorney, and then he completely turned his back on her, stepping away from the toxic poison of the Preston family forever. Audrey collapsed onto the carpet, clutching the divorce papers and wailing in absolute despair. My former mother-in-law was still kneeling on the floor, reaching her hands out toward my designer gown, continuing to beg for her son's freedom. I stood on the edge of the stage and looked down at the pathetic ruins of the people who had tried to bury me alive. I did not feel the need to shout or gloat. I did not feel the need to curse at them or demand apologies for the years of emotional abuse. The ultimate revenge was not my anger, but my complete and total indifference. I picked up the elegant skirt of my crimson-red gown and slowly walked down the wooden stairs. My mother-in-law reached out to grab my ankle, still sobbing my name, but I smoothly stepped entirely out of her reach. I did not acknowledge her tears. I did not look at my father-in-law's broken face or Audrey's pathetic collapse. I walked right past them with my head held extremely high, treating them like absolute invisible strangers in a crowded room. The heavy mahogany doors at the end of the grand ballroom were wide open, revealing the cool night air and a beautiful, limitless future. I walked out of the hotel flanked by my elite attorney and my brilliant new chief financial officer, leaving the screaming, desperate family trapped forever in the massive prison of their own creation. 2 years have passed since the explosive night in the grand ballroom. The massive shockwaves of the corporate scandal eventually settled down, leaving a completely reshaped landscape in Silicon Valley. Time has an incredible way of exposing the absolute truth and balancing the scales of justice. Ryan Preston, the man who once believed he was an untouchable tech god, is currently wearing a standard orange jumpsuit in a minimum security federal prison in Nevada. He was sentenced to 15 agonizing years for orchestrated wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and lying to federal investigators. His arrogant charm and his expensive tailored suits could not save him when the massive mountain of digital evidence was officially presented in federal court. He tried to hire the most expensive defense attorneys in the country, but his bank accounts were permanently frozen by the government. He lost his freedom, his fake billionaire status, and his completely shattered reputation. He spends his days sitting in a tiny concrete cell entirely stripped of the luxurious world he tried to steal. Vanessa Montgomery faced an equally devastating reality check. The Federal Securities and Exchange Commission permanently banned her from ever holding a corporate management position or trading public stocks for the rest of her natural life. She tried to turn against Ryan to save herself, but the federal prosecutors had more than enough evidence from my encrypted hard drive to convict her anyway. Stripped of her stolen millions and facing massive legal fines, she was forced to file for absolute total bankruptcy. She now lives in a tiny rented apartment in a run-down neighborhood, entirely abandoned by the wealthy elite circle she had so desperately tried to impress. She has to work a regular minimum wage job just to pay her basic bills, completely erased from the glamorous tech industry forever. The toxic Preston family faced their own bitter karma. Without Ryan's stolen corporate funds to support their lavish lifestyle, they completely dissolved into obscure poverty. They lost their luxurious estates, their expensive cars, and their arrogant pride. Audrey finalized her divorce and received absolutely nothing from Jamal because of a strict prenuptial agreement she had arrogantly signed years ago, thinking she would always be richer than him. But from the ashes of their lies, a truly powerful and honest empire was born. OmniStream technology did not collapse after the scandal. Under my absolute majority ownership, I completely restructured the entire executive board and removed every single corrupt manager Ryan had hired. I did not step into the massive spotlight to run the daily operations myself, because I knew exactly who the most qualified and highly principled man for the job truly was. I officially appointed Jamal as the new chief executive officer of the corporation. Jamal took the massive broken pieces of the company and rebuilt them with total transparency and unmatched financial brilliance. Without the toxic anchor of his greedy former wife and the manipulative Preston family pulling him down, Jamal flourished into one of the most respected tech leaders in the entire industry. We took the company public a year later under entirely honest terms, and the stock valuations skyrocketed beyond our wildest expectations. Today, I am standing in the massive glass corner office on the top floor of our brand new corporate headquarters. I am holding a simple cup of warm coffee, looking out through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling, brilliant landscape of Silicon Valley below me. The bright morning sun is casting a beautiful golden light over the entire city. I am no longer the quiet, invisible housewife waiting in the shadows for a greedy man to acknowledge my worth. I am the sole chairwoman of a multi-billion-dollar technology empire. I look at my own reflection in the clear glass, and I feel a profound sense of absolute peace. The ultimate revenge was never about destroying Ryan simply out of spite or broken heartbreak. It was about surgically removing the cancer of deceit and reclaiming the massive financial value that I had quietly built with my own hands. I took back my supreme power, my dignity, and my entire future. I take a deep breath of the cool air conditioning, feeling the quiet, steady hum of a massive, successful company working perfectly beneath my feet. The brutal war is officially over, and the absolute right people have finally won. The most profound lesson to be learned from this entire story is the catastrophic danger of arrogance and the massive fatal mistake of underestimating quiet, unshakable strength. True power does not always scream for attention or demand the loudest voice in the crowded room. Real power often observes, calculates, and patiently waits for the absolute perfect moment to execute a flawless strategic move. Ryan and Vanessa built their entire fragile empire on a crumbling foundation of greedy lies and selfish manipulation. They foolishly believed that a supportive, loyal spouse was nothing more than a weak, disposable stepping stone on their ruthless path to unimaginable wealth. They completely failed to understand that the person who quietly manages the financial foundation of your life also holds the absolute power to collapse the entire building with a single calculated push. Furthermore, this story proves that unwavering integrity, like the quiet courage displayed by Jamal, is the ultimate long-term investment. Greed might offer a temporary, thrilling illusion of massive success, but it is always a fast track to absolute total destruction. Honesty and precise calculation will always outlast the brightest fake smiles in the corporate world. When you push a highly intelligent and fiercely loyal person into a dark corner, they will not just cry and surrender to their fate. They will meticulously dismantle your entire universe piece by piece and legally take everything you thought you owned. Never underestimate the woman standing behind you. She might be the one keeping the books for your entire life. Have you ever had to take back what was yours? Comment below.